It is a little before 7 on a cold morning in October, in the London of 1851, and the first thing, before anything you can see, is the coal. Every room in this city that has a fire has lit it within the last hour, and the smoke is coming down rather than going up because the air is heavy and the river is close, and there is nowhere else for it to go. It settles at about the height of a face, and it tastes faintly of metal. In 10 minutes you will have stopped noticing it, and nothing else will smell of anything much for the rest of the day. The street is already going. Carts are coming in from the market gardens south of the river, loaded with what was pulled out of the ground yesterday afternoon. A man passes with a milk can, and the milk in it was inside a cow, in a shed behind a shop, about 20 minutes ago. Somewhere close to where you are standing, a letter is going into a box, and it will be read and answered, and the answer will be back at this address by 2 o'clock this afternoon. There are up to 12 deliveries a day in the middle of this city. Almost nothing we assume about the slowness of the past survives contact with the London Post of 1851. In March of this year, the government counted everybody in London, and the figure it arrived at was 2,362,236. That precision is not a flourish. Somebody walked to every door. Nobody had built a city this size before anywhere, and there was no accumulated wisdom about what 2.33 million people standing in one place would do to the ground underneath them. The ground was beginning to show it. The noise is horses, mainly, iron tires on granite, thousands of them, all day, a sound that no longer exists and that every visitor to this city wrote home about, and that every resident had long since stopped hearing. Underneath the horses are the cries. Everything that can be sold here is sold by somebody shouting about it, and the shouts are so particular to their trades that a Londoner can tell what has just turned into the street without looking up from whatever they are holding. We know what they shouted and what it paid and what they thought of the work, because for 2 years before this morning, a journalist had been going out into these streets and asking them, and then writing the answers down in the words he was given. His name was Henry Mayhew. The Morning Chronicle ran his letters through 1849 and 1850, and by this autumn he is putting them out himself in cheap parts, sold in the same streets he collected them from. It is one of the strangest documents in the language, and one of the most useful. Almost everything we can say with any confidence about how the poor of this city actually lived, we can say, because he sat down in their rooms and let them talk for as long as they wanted to. That post is worth staying with for a moment because it is the part of this morning hardest to hold in the head. An argument could be carried on at a distance, across a single day in installments. And between one delivery and the next, there was a particular quality of waiting. It is the kind of waiting where the answer already exists somewhere and is simply not yet with you. We recognize the feeling. The apparatus has changed a great deal, and the sensation has not changed at all. And about 2 miles west of where we are standing, in Hyde Park, there is a building made of glass and iron, and in a few weeks it is going to be taken apart and carried away. Since the 1st of May, a little over 6 million admissions have gone through it. Nobody in this street thinks of it as history. They think of it as somewhere they went in the summer, or as somewhere they never had the shilling to go. None of it reaches us. The fires went out a long time ago. Every one of them is gone. The man with the milk can, the woman waiting her turn at the standpipe, the boy sweeping the crossing for a coin, the clerk who walked to his desk because the omnibus fare was more than he could spare. They have been gone so long that even the grandchildren who might have remembered them are gone. The smoke cleared, the streets were widened or renamed or built over, and most of the people who did that work are gone as well. You are warm, and it is now, and the morning we are about to walk into finished 175 years ago. Something happens when we sit for a while with a city this far back, and it is worth naming before we go in. It is not pity. Pity would be presumptuous, and none of these people asked for any. What settles instead is closer to recognition, the slow understanding that people have been getting up in the cold and going out to work and worrying about the price of bread for a very long time, and that they were doing it well before us, and mostly without leaving any record at all. The few we can still hear are the ones whose words somebody happened to write down. Before we walk back into it, if you find yourself drawn to this kind of slow reading of the ordinary past, to hours spent in the company of people who left almost nothing behind them, consider subscribing, and there will be more nights like this one waiting for us. And let us know in the comments where you are listening from tonight, your city and your time zone. This morning ended a very long time ago, and it is a quiet pleasure to know how far it has carried. Now let us begin where everybody in this city began, with the room they woke up in. In 1847, a group of men from the London Statistical Society went into the houses of Church Lane, in the parish of St. Giles, and measured the air. Not the rooms. The air, how much of it there was per person in the space where people slept. The figure they came out with was between 52 and 175 cubic feet each, depending on the house. Prison regulations of the same period worked to 1,000. 52 cubic feet is a cube about 3 feet 9 inches along each side. It would not hold a grown person lying down. That was one man's share of the air in the worst of those houses. Not the floor he had, and not the room, but the whole volume of breathable atmosphere allotted to him for a night. The same allotment covered everybody else who slept in there, and whatever else was in the room with them. It is a hard number to feel until you set it against a room you have stood in. A small modern bedroom, 10 feet by 10 under an 8-foot ceiling, comes to 800 cubic feet. That is one person's share, in a house where nobody gives the air a thought. They measured air rather than floor space because air was what the period believed made people ill. Disease was understood to travel through the atmosphere, in the smell of a drain, a graveyard, a crowded room, and so the quantity of air a person had became a figure worth collecting. It was the kind of number a reforming society could put in front of Parliament and expect somebody to look at. 3 years later, a book appeared under the title The Rookeries of London. Its author was a curate at St. James's, Westminster, a man called Thomas Beames, who was not a radical and had no programme of any kind, and who had simply walked into 6 districts of his own city and written down what was in them. A second edition followed in 1852. It sold, which tells us something about how little most Londoners knew about the London a mile from where they lived. A rookery was not a slum in the loose modern sense of a poor district. It described a particular arrangement of buildings. Houses put up 100 years earlier for one family, or for a family and a workshop, had been divided and let and divided again until every room held a household and some rooms held 2. The stairs between them were shared by 50 or 60 people who were not related to one another in any way. Behind those houses, on ground that had once been gardens or yards, other buildings had gone up, reached from the street through a single passage, sometimes wide enough for one person at a time. Courts, they were called. A court might be 8 feet across with dwellings on both sides, and one privy at the far end of it serving everybody who lived there. That March count also found 109,000 people in London who had been born in Ireland, close to 5% of the whole city, and the highest proportion the record has ever shown. It undercounts because children born in England to Irish parents were entered as English. They had come after the potato failed, and they had come to the districts where rent was taken weekly, and nobody wanted references. Holborn, St Giles, Whitechapel, the parishes south of the river. St Giles was known locally as the Holy Land, which was a joke about the Irish, and was not always meant unkindly. Water came into these courts the way a delivery comes. The companies that supplied London turned it on for a few hours, on some days of the week, into a standpipe or a butt in the yard. And when it came on, everybody living around that yard needed to be standing there. Whatever was going to be drunk, cooked with and washed in before the next time had to be caught in that window, carried up whatever stairs there were, and stored in whatever would hold it. A woman with 4 children and nothing large enough to fill was simply short until the pipe ran again. The queue at the standpipe was where most of the arguments in a court happened, and the reason is not complicated. It was the one moment in the week when a fixed quantity of something everybody needed was handed out among people who all needed it at exactly the same time. None of this stayed inside the rookeries, which is the part most easily lost. 10 minutes walk from Church Lane on Dean Street in Soho, in a house nobody passing would have called a slum, that same census recorded 18 people living at number 28. It was not remarkable for the street. The houses along it were running at something close to 14 apiece. On the top floor, in 2 rooms, there was a journalist who wrote for newspapers abroad, his wife, their surviving children, and a housekeeper who had come with the wife's family and stayed on without wages. They had moved in during 1850 and they would still be there in 1856. 3 of the children born to that household did not leave Dean Street alive, 2 of them as infants and a boy of 8 in his father's arms. It is worth holding on to that address. The figure can be checked at the other end of the city, using exactly the same measurement. West of the parks, Thomas Cubitt went on laying out stucco terraces to a plan that hardly varied until his death in 1855. And in those houses, a first-floor drawing room of 20 feet by 30, under a 14-foot ceiling, was nothing out of the ordinary. That comes to 8,400 cubic feet. One room, used by 4 people after dinner, and by nobody at all for most of the day, holding more air than 150 people had between them in Church Lane. You do not have to reach for that comparison. The men doing the measuring made it themselves, in print, and expected it to land. The same house distributed its own air unequally, floor by floor. Ceilings were tallest on the ground and first floors where the family received. Above that, they came down at every story, until the attic where the maids slept had perhaps 7 feet of headroom and a window the size of a tray. Below the pavement, the kitchen had less daylight than the attic, and a great deal more heat. What was done about all of this is where the century's account of itself comes apart. In 1847, the inner part of the St Giles Rookery came down for a new road, and New Oxford Street was an improvement by every standard the word carried at the time. It was wide, straight, well-drained, open to the light, and it carried traffic that had been strangling in the lanes behind, and it cleared away some of the worst housing in Europe by the direct method of knocking it over. About 5,000 people were living in what it knocked over. Nothing was built for them. No obligation existed to build anything for them, and no mechanism existed by which it could have been done. They picked up what they owned and walked a few hundred yards. Into Church Lane and the courts behind it, into the Devil's Acre at Westminster, into whatever would take them. The districts that received them became worse than the district that had been cleared. The measurement of Church Lane was taken in 1847. 52 cubic feet is, at least in part, what an improvement looks like from underneath. Beams watched it happen and said so in print. He was not writing against improvement. and it would flatter him to turn him into a reformer of the modern kind. His book is conventional in places about the character of the people in it, in the way a respectable clergyman of 1850 was conventional. But he had walked the same ground before and after. He could count, and what he wrote down is most of what we have. There is nothing especially historical about the mechanism. A place is condemned because the conditions in it really are intolerable, and the condemning is well meant, and the people living in those conditions are not part of the plan that follows. Because they are the problem being solved rather than the population being housed. They go somewhere, and the somewhere is nearby, and it is already full. You can walk the ground now in about 4 minutes, and New Oxford Street is still wide and still there. Church Lane is gone. The name survives a few streets away, attached to something else. And what stood in the courts behind it lies under offices and a stretch of pavement that several thousand people cross every morning without any reason to think about it. Inside those rooms on a morning in 1851, none of it presented itself as arithmetic. It presented itself as a room too warm and too close, with 4 people in it, who all had to be somewhere by a particular hour, and as the noise coming up through the window from the street below. That noise had been going since long before anybody upstairs was awake. It was where the money was. There is a figure against a wall in the half-dark, moving slowly along the base of it, stopping every few yards. Each time it stops, it bends, picks something off the pavement with a gloved hand or a scrap of tin, and moves on. A bucket takes most of a day to fill, and how long it actually takes depends on the weather, the season, and how many other people have already walked that wall since yesterday. What goes into the bucket is dog dung. They were called pure finders, and the word pure was not a joke at their expense. It was simply the trade name for the material, the way a fishmonger says, roe. Somewhere between 200 and 300 of them were working London around 1850. They sold by the stable bucket to the tanneries of Bermondsey at 8p to 10p, and a really good bucket might fetch a shilling and 2p. Good meant dry and pale and limey looking, because the dry sort carried more of the alkali that did the work. The work it did was to leather. Hide comes off an animal stiff and heavy, and something has to be got into the grain of it before it can be cut or sewn or worn. And for several centuries in England that something was dog dung, worked into the skins by hand in a pit, by men standing in the pit. A Bermondsey tannery employing 300 or 400 tanners would keep about 20 finders supplied, which means that a pair of boots in 1851, or a saddle or a ledger bound in calf, had come down a chain that began with somebody walking a wall before dawn with a bucket. We know the price of a bucket of it because somebody asked, and that is a stranger fact than it sounds. There is an enormous amount of writing about the London poor from these years. Sermons, pamphlets, parliamentary evidence, novels, letters to the papers, and almost all of it was produced by people who had settled their opinions before they arrived. Mayhew's method was to sit down, ask what the work was, ask what it paid, ask what came out of the payment before anything was left, and then write the answers in the words he had been given them in, including the answers that made him look foolish. He was not a systematic man. Where he attempted totals for the whole city, his arithmetic tends to come apart under pressure, and later scholars have spent a good deal of energy taking those numbers to pieces. The interviews are a different matter altogether. They are close to the only place in the entire record where the people doing this work describe it themselves, at length, and are not improved on the way to the page. 8p then for a day of it. Bacon ran to 4p or 6p the pound, and the American sort, cheaper, and by now, everywhere, was what a household bought if it bought any at all. with bread making up the rest of the diet and most of the outlay. So a full bucket came to a pound of bacon and a little over, and the day it had taken to fill was the day the bucket had to cover. You have almost certainly run that sum yourself, in a bad month, in the way that keeps a person up later than they meant to be. What is different about 1851 is not the sum. It is the margin that for a very large number of people in this city, the answer came out close to level every single day, with nothing behind it on the days it did not. Down at the river, the same principle produced a different trade. When the tide went out, it left several hundred yards of mud along both banks of the Thames, and in the mud was whatever had gone over the side of a ship, or a wharf, or a bridge. Coal mostly, and lengths of rope, and copper nails worth a great deal more than coal and bone. The people who waded out into it were called mudlarks, and were mostly children, and they went barefoot because boots came off in that mud and did not come back. Their working day was set by the moon rather than by any clock, which meant that it moved. Low water arrives about 50 minutes later each day, so a mudlark's hours travelled steadily around the face of the day, and the child who had been out in the mud at 7 in the morning was, a fortnight later, out in it at 7 at night. On the streets above, the mud was of another kind, and this is worth being exact about because the word has been softened by 170 years of use. London mud was horse. A city that moved everything by animal produced a continuous layer of it, ground into the wet by wheels, and spread evenly across the road surface, and to cross a street in anything but dry weather was to put your feet into it. So there were crossing sweepers. A sweeper took a corner, kept a strip of it clear, stood at the edge while people walked across the clean part, and was paid whatever the person crossing felt like paying, which was frequently nothing at all. They were mostly the very young and the very old, and that was not an accident. The trade ran on sympathy, and sympathy went to whoever looked least capable of doing anything else. A good corner was a possession, and it was defended. Everything that could be eaten standing up was sold in these streets, and the trade in it was enormous. Hot eels came in a cup with the liquor they had been boiled in. There was pea soup, and pickled whelks, and sheep's trotters, and plum duff, and hot cross buns, and in the summer months there was ice cream. Baked potatoes came out of a portable tray heated underneath with coal, and the cry that went with them was one every Londoner could reproduce. Bake tatters, all hot, all hot. In winter, a good share of the people who bought one bought it to hold. It went into the pockets first and was eaten later, once it had stopped being useful as a heater. The stalls were out from about 10:30 in the morning until about 10 at night, and there were more of them than the trade could carry. One coffee stall keeper put the position to Mayhew in a sentence nobody has since improved on. "Two of us," he said, "are eating one man's bread." All of these trades were drawn and engraved for the illustrated papers, and in most of those pictures they looked charming. The sweeper a scamp with his cap pushed back, the coffee stall a warm island in a blue night, the mudlark barefoot in a way that reads as freedom rather than as the absence of boots. The reason the trades existed has nothing charming in it. Every other way of earning money in this city asked for something up front: a tool, a stock, an apprenticeship served, a character from a former employer, somebody respectable prepared to speak for you. Collecting required a bucket, sweeping required a broom, and going into the mud required going into the mud. That was the whole of the appeal, and it is why these trades filled and stayed full, and why the money in them stayed exactly where it was. Anyone could start on Monday. That is not the same thing as anyone being able to live. Among the people Mayhew stopped and questioned was a girl who sold watercress. She was 8 years old. The trade worked like this. Cress came into the markets before dawn, in season, and was bought in bulk by whoever had the halfpence to buy it, and was then tied into small bunches and sold through the morning by the handful. And if it had not gone by noon, it wilted and was worth nothing. It was a trade a child could enter for exactly the reason all of them could. He set down what she was wearing because he set down what everybody was wearing: a thin dress, a shawl that had gone to pieces, carpet slippers, in weather that was not weather for any of it. He noted that she had lost every childish way she might once have had, and that in her thinking and her manner she was a woman. Then he did the thing an adult does when a child is standing in front of them. He asked her about games and about toys and about what she liked. The look she gave him ended that. He wrote it down as he wrote everything down, that the amazement on her face put a stop to any attempt at fun on his part. Caring about sugar sticks, she told him, was a thing for children, and not for somebody with a living to earn and food to find. Then she said, the line that has outlasted everything else he ever took down. I ain't a child and I shan't be a woman till I'm 20, but I'm past 8 I am. Earning a living was not, for a very large number of people in this city, a matter of going out and doing it. Most mornings it was a matter of being chosen by a man standing above a crowd from among several hundred others who also needed to be chosen. If you had been standing outside the gate of the London dock at 7:30 on a winter morning, you would have been one of those several hundred pressed against iron railings in the dark, and you would have been there for an hour already. The gates opened. A foreman came out and began picking, by face where he knew the face, by luck where he did not, and the picking took a few minutes. The men who had been picked went in, the gate closed behind them, and everybody else was left standing in the street with the whole day ahead and nothing in it. What waited on the other side of that gate was not light work. Cargo came out of a hold in nets and off a quay on backs. The day was measured by how much of it moved, and the men moving it were employed by companies with no interest in them beyond the hours immediately in front of them. A man who was strong at 25 was ordinary at 35 and finished at 50. And a man finished at 50 had no pension, no claim, and no trade to fall back into because the entire premise of the work was that it required no trade. This happened twice a day at every dock in London. Mayhew, who counted things and was usually candid about how little his counting was worth, put the average earnings of a casual dock labourer at about 5 shillings a week, and then explained more or less in the same breath that an average meant almost nothing in this trade, because the earnings were so precarious and so variable that a man and everyone depending on him could simply go without. None of this was accidental, and it is worth resisting the instinct to read it as inefficiency. Keeping the pool of available men permanently larger than the quantity of available work is precisely what held the price of a day's labour down, and the dock companies understood that as clearly as anybody. A man standing outside the gate at 8 in the morning with nothing to do had not fallen through the system. He was the reason it functioned. The same arrangement, moved indoors and applied to women, produced the slop trade. Slop was the trade name for ready-made clothing, and it worked by putting the work out. A woman collected cut cloth from a piece master or a piece mistress, who had it from a warehouse, and she made it up at home and she carried it back, finished, and she was paid by the dozen. The work happened wherever she lived, which meant the room she slept in was also the workshop, and the garments had to be kept clean in a room where keeping anything clean was not straightforward. Children in the household sewed as soon as their hands were steady enough, not as an apprenticeship, but as arithmetic. A second pair of hands was another shirt, and another shirt was another penny. For shirts, the rate at the top of the trade ran between 2 shillings and 6 shillings the dozen. At the bottom of it, The rate was a shilling the dozen. A penny a shirt. That figure repays sitting with rather than moving past, because the first thing it does is mislead. It sounds like a price, and it is not a price. It is a gross figure before deductions. And in this trade, the deductions came out of the worker rather than the person handing out the work. She found her own thread, her own cotton, and her own trimmings. Everything that went into the garment except the buttons, which were supplied. So the penny was never a penny. It was a penny less the materials, and the materials had to be bought before the shirt could be started, which meant she was carrying the cost of the work in advance of being paid anything for it. And if she worked past the light, she bought the light. There is a further turn in it that is easy to walk straight past. Because she paid for her materials up front and was paid only on delivery, a woman in this trade was permanently a small creditor to the person giving her the work. She always had money out in the form of cloth and thread she had bought and not yet been paid for making up. Any interruption at all would find her already spent. An illness, a child ill, a week when the piecemaster had nothing to hand out. A penny in 1851 bought about 1/4 pound of the cheap American bacon. Rather less than that after the thread came out of it. If you had gone up those stairs at 10 at night, you would have found her still working, with the cloth held close to her face because the light was poor, and she would have looked up and gone back to it without stopping, because stopping was measured in shirts. None of this was a secret. In December of 1843, Punch had printed a poem called The Song of the Shirt, written by Thomas Hood about precisely this trade, and it went through the country like weather. It was set to music. It was recited at public meetings and quoted in Parliament. It became one of the most widely circulated English poems of the century, and it is still the thing most people can name when they think of a Victorian needlewoman at all. The rate did not move. There is nothing antique about the shape of that arrangement. Payment by the piece, at a rate set by whoever holds the work rather than by whoever does it, with the cost of tools and materials falling on the person being paid, and no guarantee of any work at all the following week. The shape has lasted because it functions perfectly well from one direction. The risk sits with the person least equipped to carry it, and that person has no mechanism for pricing it in. Some of this work was already illegal, which changed less than it ought to have. An Act of 1840 had made it unlawful to send anyone under 16 up a chimney. It was ignored so completely that the evidence suggests the number of children in the trade rose rather than fell after it passed. Select committees took evidence again in 1852 and again in 1853, and neither produced a bill. The reason is not obscure. A mechanical brush existed and had existed for decades. It cost more than a boy, and it did not reach into the angles of an old flue the way a boy's hands reached, and the householders paying for the sweeping were not the people going up the chimney. The boys were apprenticed to master sweeps, which gave the whole arrangement the outward shape of a trade rather than the shape of what it actually was. The cancer these boys developed in adolescence had been identified in 1775 by the London surgeon Percival Pott, and it was the first occupational cancer ever described in medical literature. 76 years later, boys were still going up. The pattern held across a great many trades. In the tanneries, the men working the pits stood in what they were working with, in maintained heat for hours at a stretch. Bone boilers rendered down what the slaughterhouses could not sell, and their premises could be located from several streets away with the eyes shut. Laundresses worked over coppers in rooms with no ventilation, hands in hot water, and lie for the length of a working day, and the damage to the hands was permanent and visible. A person's trade could be read off their body in the street, and frequently so could the number of years they had been at it. All of this was happening to people in their 20s. That is the part hardest to keep hold of. The body being used up at the dock gate and over the copper and in the tanning pit was in those same years a body expected to find somebody and marry and set up a household and produce the next generation of people who would do this work. There was no arrangement by which the wearing out and the courting took place in sequence. They took place at once, in the same body, in the same decade of a life, and nothing in the record suggests that anybody at the time considered this worth remarking on. There is a page in a parish register, and on it a marriage recorded in the ordinary way. The columns ask the same things of everybody: the date, the names, the ages, the condition of each party, bachelor, spinster, widower, widow, the rank or profession, the address at the time of the marriage, and then the father's name and the father's occupation for both of them. Underneath all of that, the signatures. One of them has signed, the other has made a cross, and beside the cross the clerk has written her name and the words that make it stand, her mark. That cross is worth precisely what the signature is worth. The marriage is not less valid, not conditional, not provisional in any degree. Two people who could not read the register had married in a service neither of them could read, and the record of it binds as tightly as any record in England. What is odd about the page is not the cross. It is that the two people signing were entering an arrangement in which one of them was about to stop existing as a separate legal person, and nothing on the page mentions it, because nothing on the page needed to. Everyone knew. Getting to that page was, for most Londoners, free. Marriage by banns meant the intention was read aloud in the parish church on 3 consecutive Sundays, and if nobody objected across those 3 weeks, the couple could marry. The publicity was the mechanism. 3 Sundays was the window in which anyone who knew of a reason, an existing wife, an existing husband, a relation too close, could stand up and say so. A license cost pounds and did away with the Sundays. It bought speed and quiet, which meant that the people who wanted speed and quiet bought it, and everybody else married in the most public manner available in the country, in front of every person they knew, 3 weeks running. Since 1836 there had also been the Register Office, which required no church at all. More than 1 million couples used it over the course of the century, and a good number appear to have chosen it for the same reason others bought a license, which was that it attracted less notice. Courtships were often short, and engagements were often very long, and the reason was money. Not the wedding. By banns, the wedding cost almost nothing. What had to be assembled first was a household, a room to rent, something to sleep on, a pot, a table, and enough behind all of it to survive the first week in which one of the two was not earning. Against wages of the kind the docks and the needle trades were paying, that took years. Engagements of 3 and 4 and 5 years were ordinary, and those years came out of the middle of a person's 20s. If you have ever saved for a long stretch towards something that could not begin until the saving was finished, you know the particular quality of those years. A life running along beside the plan for it, and not waiting for the plan to be ready. A great many couples did not bother at all, and what is interesting about that is how little scandal it produced. Living together without marrying was widespread and not uniformly condemned, especially among people who had come to London from somewhere else and left a complication behind them. Promises exchanged in front of witnesses and followed by cohabitation had a long history in England of being treated as a marriage in fact, whatever the paperwork said, and a large number of households simply ran on that basis and described themselves as married. They did it because there was no other way to arrange it. There was no exit from a marriage. What a woman entered on the day of the wedding was a doctrine called coverture, and the word repays hearing properly because it means exactly what it sounds like. She was covered. In law, a husband and wife were one person, and that person was the husband. Everything she owned on the morning of the wedding became his by the afternoon. Anything she inherited afterwards became his on arrival. Anything she earned, and a very large number of wives earned, was his from the moment it was paid. She could not make a contract, could not sue or be sued, could not hold property in her own name, and had no standing to refuse him. The children were his, which means that a woman sewing shirts at a penny each, buying her own thread, working past the light and paying for the light, was earning her husband's money. If he chose to take it to a public house, that was a transaction between him and himself. The same body of law fixed the age at which a girl could legally consent and fixed it at 12. Very few women knew any of this in detail until they were already inside it. And in 1854, somebody did something about that, which sounds modest and was not. A short book appeared that set out, in plain language and without argument, what the laws concerning women actually said. It did not editorialize, and it did not appeal. It stated the position clause by clause, in sentences an ordinary reader could follow, on the working theory that the law's best protection had always been that almost nobody had read it. The author was Barbara Lee Smith, and the book was called A Brief Summary in Plain Language of the Most Important Laws Concerning Women. 2 years later, she organized a petition for the reform of married women's property law, and it carried 26,000 signatures. A petition had to be laid before Parliament by a member of Parliament, and there were no women in Parliament, so 26,000 women's names arrived in the hands of 2 men, Lord Brougham and Sir Thomas Erskine Perry. There is a particular sensation that arrives when a rule is read closely for the first time and turns out not to run both ways. You have probably had it with a contract, or a policy, or a set of conditions nobody ever expected anybody to reach the end of. It is a small, cold adjustment, and the Great Reform of 1857 produces it reliably. Before that year, ending a marriage required a private act of Parliament, an individual law made about 2 named people, passed by the legislature of the United Kingdom. It was available to anyone who could afford to have a law made about them, which is another way of saying it was not available. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 changed that. It created a court. It came into force on the 1st of January of the following year. And for the first time in English history, a marriage could be brought to an end without going to Parliament for it. For a husband, the ground was his wife's adultery. That was the whole of it. For a wife, the grounds were her husband's incestuous adultery, or bigamy with adultery, or rape, or sodomy, or bestiality, or adultery coupled with cruelty of a degree that would by itself have entitled her to a separation, or adultery coupled with desertion, without reasonable excuse, for 2 years or upwards. That is the list, not a summary of it. And this was the reform. This was the liberal measure argued for by reformers, resisted by the other side, and carried through as an improvement in the position of women, which, on any honest reading, it was. 4 of those grounds can be traced back to what had been done to one woman. She was a writer and a successful one, and everything she earned belonged in law to a husband she had separated from. He kept the children, because the children were his. When she published, the money was his. She had learned the law in the only way it was possible for a married woman to learn it, which was by having it applied to her, clause by clause, across about 20 years. All of that happened to Caroline Norton, and in 1855 she wrote a letter to the Queen and had it printed. The argument in it reads less like a plea than like a description. A woman setting out, in detail and with unfailing courtesy, the precise legal position of a married Englishwoman in a country reigned over by a woman, under laws in which a wife had no separate existence at all. The word that usually gets attached to all of this is repression, and it is the wrong word. Repression describes a society nervous about desire, policing it, pressing it underground. What the record shows is a society operating a property system in which marriage transferred assets, in which those assets included a person's labor and a person's children, and in which the transfer had to be permanent or the whole structure came apart. The asymmetry in those divorce grounds is not squeamishness. A wife's adultery threatened an inheritance because it threatened the paternity of the heir. A husband's did not. Every one of those grounds was drafted, debated, amended, and voted through by men in a chamber containing no women, under a franchise that included no women, governing a population more than half of which was women. That is not a Victorian condition. It is what happens wherever the people writing a rule are structurally certain of never being on the receiving end of it, and it produces the same recognizable object every time. A rule that reads as perfectly reasonable to everybody who will never have to use it. Back on the page, none of this shows. 2 people sign, or 1 signs and 1 makes a cross. 2 witnesses put their names underneath, and the clerk closes the book. They walk out into whatever afternoon it is, toward the room they have spent 5 years saving for, and the door shuts behind them on an arrangement that will run for the rest of both their lives. Outside, the light goes off the street they came down. It keeps going without them into the evening, and then into the part of the night when almost the only person still moving on it is being paid to be there. He is walking at about 2.5 miles an hour, and that figure is not an accident. It is an instruction. A beat was a fixed route, walked at a fixed pace, so that the constable arrived at every point along it at a time that could be predicted by his sergeant, who needed to find him without hunting for him. Predicted by the householders on the route, who needed to know roughly when he would pass. And predicted, unavoidably, by anyone intending to do something in the gap between one passing and the next. He is in a blue tailcoat and a tall hat of varnished leather. He carries handcuffs, a wooden rattle that could be heard several hundred feet away, and was the only means he had of calling for help, and a lantern. The lantern is the good piece of engineering. It is an oil lamp with a lens set in front of the flame to gather the light into a beam, and a shutter that closes over the lens to put the beam out without putting the flame out, so that a man could stand in a doorway in total darkness with a lit lamp held against his ribs and open it at the moment of his choosing. He also carries a truncheon 20 inches of turned wood in a long pocket sewn into the tail of the coat where nobody could see it. That concealment was deliberate, and it was political. The whole force had been founded on the argument that it was a civilian body and not a soldiery, and a visible weapon carried openly on an English street would have made the argument impossible to sustain. The argument needed sustaining because a great many Londoners had never accepted it. The Metropolitan Police had been created in 1829, which put it comfortably inside living memory for almost every adult in the city. People remembered the streets before there were policemen walking on them, and a substantial number preferred the memory. The objection had nothing to do with whether the police worked. It was constitutional, and it was seriously held. That a permanent, uniformed body, paid by the state, patrolling English streets and watching English people going about their business, was a thing that happened in France. The nicknames carried the whole complaint. Peelers, crushers, and raw lobsters on the joke that soldiers in their red coats were boiled ones, and that these were the same creature at an earlier stage. The mechanism is recognizable enough. A new authority arrives on a street that has never had one, in a uniform, on a schedule, and the argument about whether this is protection or supervision divides more or less exactly along the line of who spends their life indoors. People with rooms to be in experience the beat as reassurance. People whose work and sleep and social life all took place in public experienced it as a man who came past every 20 minutes and looked at them. How many of these men there were in the 1850s is a question the record does not answer as tidily as it ought to. The force's own administration was unsettled through the decade. It had been run jointly by two commissioners since its founding, and when the junior of the two, William Hay, died in August of 1855, an act was passed restructuring it under a single commissioner with two assistants. Richard Mayne, who had been in post since the first day in 1829, held that single office for the next 13 years. What the beat actually saw is a harder gap again. What survives in the archive is what got as far as a charge, and what got as far as a charge is a very small proportion of what a man walking 2.5 miles an hour observed in a night. There was another kind of policeman, and there were almost none of them. The detective branch had been set up in 1842 with an establishment of 2 inspectors and 6 sergeants. 8 men in plain clothes for a city of 2.33 million. The plain clothes were the difficulty. A beat constable was visible on principle. That was the entire design, and the tall hat was part of it. A policeman who could not be seen coming was, to precisely the people who had objected to the uniform, a spy. The man who ran the detectives from 1846 had joined the force as a sergeant in E Division, having wanted to be an actor and discovered he could not afford to be one. Charles Frederick Field was, on the evidence, still a performer, and in June of 1851, Dickens spent a night walking with him and published the result as the lead article in Household Words on the 14th. You can read it. It has never been difficult to find, and it is short. Field moves through the lodging houses of the worst districts in the city with a lantern and an air of total proprietorship, turning the light onto sleeping men, addressing them by name, reciting their histories back to them, and being obeyed. Dickens found the performance thrilling, and it is not hard to see why. It reads like competence. It is also an account of a man entering rooms where people are asleep and putting a light on their faces, because nobody in those rooms was in any position to stop him. What the light was mostly finding was not crime in any sense that would survive translation into the present. A very large share of what the police in this city handled had no victim at all. Sleeping out, vagrancy, obstruction, loitering, drunk and disorderly, being found in a place for an unlawful purpose. The offences were defined by visibility, and the people who were visible were the people with nowhere else to be. A crossing sweeper standing at his corner with his broom was either a man at his trade or a man begging, and which of the two he was on any given evening rested entirely with the constable. A child lifting coal off the foreshore was either a scavenger taking what the tide had left, or a thief taking somebody's property, and the answer turned on whether anyone had ever established who owned the mud. The line between poor and criminal was not fixed anywhere in 1851. It was drawn fresh on the street by a man on a route at 2.5 miles an hour. There is a consolation buried in that of an odd sort. The Old Bailey printed its proceedings and sold them, and they survive, which means the largest single body of ordinary Londoners speaking in their own words from this decade comes to us out of a criminal court. Witnesses describing their rooms and their hours, defendants accounting for their evenings, neighbors explaining who was standing where and when, and what was said. Almost everything we have of how these people actually talked exists, because somebody was on trial. What happened after a conviction was changing faster than anything else here. For 70 years, the answer to serious crime had been to remove the person from the country altogether. Transportation to New South Wales was abolished on the 1st of October 1850. The order ending it for Van Diemen's Land came in 1853. Only Western Australia went on taking convicts, and only until 1868. The thing worth knowing about transportation is how much of it never happened. Somewhere between a quarter and a third of everybody sentenced to be transported never left England at all. A proportion were pardoned. The rest served out their time on the hulks, decommissioned warships moored in the rivers and harbours of the south coast, stripped of masts and rigging and used as prisons because they were already there and cost nothing to build. A man could be sentenced to be sent to the far side of the world and spend the entire sentence within sight of the shore he was sentenced on. The Penal Servitude Acts of 1853 and 1857 put the replacement on a proper legal footing. Hard labour served at home in purpose-built prisons organised around silence and separation, on the theory that solitude reformed. What it amounted to in practice was that a punishment which had removed people to a continent was exchanged for one that removed them to a cell, and the second was considerably cheaper. At the other end of the scale, nothing moved at all. Public executions survived this whole decade and was not abolished until 1868. 2 years before our morning, on the 13th of November 1849, a husband and wife were hanged together outside the prison in Horsemonger Lane for a murder. Something in the region of 30,000 people came to watch. Dickens was among them, and the following day, the Times printed a letter from him about it. His objection was not to the hanging, which is the part most often left out. What he wrote was that the horrors of the gibbet and of the crime that had brought the two of them to it faded in his mind before the bearing and the looks and the language of the crowd, and that he did not believe any community could prosper where such a scene was permitted. It took another 19 years. The roots are still there in the sense that streets are hard to move. You can walk a beat now in the city or through Southwark or across what is left of the old parishes, and the turnings arrive in the same order, and the corners where a constable stood in order to be findable are still corners, and it takes about as long as it took. What has gone is the reason for it. He was on that pavement because a group of men had concluded that the way to stop things happening was to have somebody permanently present, moving slowly, visibly unarmed, looking at everyone, which was, for anybody living their life out of doors, wearing, and which is a good part of the reason that, at the end of a day of being looked at, a man with a few coppers in his pocket went and stood in the one room in London where the light was better than anywhere he had ever lived. The light came out through the windows and lay across the wet pavement in long slabs, and it was the brightest thing on that street by a margin that is hard to reconstruct now, because there is nothing left to measure it against. A modern street at night is lit from overhead, and from every shop front, and from the traffic. A street in 1851 was lit by a gas lamp every so many yards and by whatever spilled out of a window. What spilled out of these particular windows was engineered. Plate glass was new and it was expensive, and the gin palaces bought it in sheets, because a window that size turned the whole interior into an advertisement. Behind the glass, there were gas jets in numbers nobody would have burned in a house, and mirrors set to double them, and polished mahogany, and gilding on the casks, and a counter running the length of the room with a brass rail along the foot of it. There were no chairs. That is the detail that gives the whole thing away. A room with seats is a room where people stay, and a room where people stay serves fewer of them in an evening. These places were built for turnover. Come in off the street, stand at the counter, drink, be replaced. Every element of the design, the light most of all, existed to bring a man in out of the dark, and then to move him along. The contrast was the product. A man walking through that door had come from a room lit by one candle, or by the fire, or by nothing at all. He had spent the day outdoors in clothes that had not dried since morning. For the price of a glass, he was standing in warmth, in light, on a floor that somebody else had swept, among other people, and nobody in there was looking at him in the particular way he had been looked at all day. There is a question underneath this that has to be asked in the right order, and the temperance societies of the decade almost never asked it in the right order. The water in London was not safe. Everybody knew the water was not safe, though nobody yet agreed on what made it so, and the arrangements for getting hold of it were what they were. A pipe in a yard, running for a few hours on some days, into whatever the household could find to catch it in. Beer was a different proposition, and the difference lay in the making. Brewing involves boiling, and boiling, for reasons no one in 1851 was in a position to explain, produced a drink that did not do to people what water did. Small beer, weak enough to be given to children at breakfast, was not a recreation in this city. It was a food, and it was the reliable fluid. That argument is a sound one, and it holds completely, and it stops holding at the door of the gin palace. Gin is not beer. It was not brewed for safety, it was distilled for effect, and the men selling it across a mahogany counter under 40 gas jets knew precisely what they were selling. Whatever can be said in defense of a household's beer cannot be said for a man standing at that counter at 11 at night with his fourth glass in front of him. Both things are true at once, and the temperance case went wrong by refusing the first, and the modern reflex goes wrong by refusing the second. The law had already tried to legislate a way through it and produced a result nobody had planned. An Act of 1830 allowed any ratepayer to sell beer out of his own house on payment of a small annual sum, without approaching a magistrate at all. The intention was to break the spirit trade by making beer so cheap and so available that nobody would trouble with gin. Beer houses opened in enormous numbers. Whether they reduced the drinking of spirits is still argued over. What is not in dispute is that they gave a great many working streets something those streets had never had, which was a room, indoors, that was neither home nor work, and that anybody could walk into without being asked what they wanted. If you had come through the door of one of those places at 9 on a Saturday evening in a wet January, you would have found it 3 or 4 deep at the counter and difficult to hear in. The floor would have been sanded. Somebody would have shifted sideways to make room for you without being asked and without turning round, because everyone in there was doing the same thing and nobody had anywhere to sit. You would have been warmer than you had been all day. Eating happened in public in this city to a degree that is easy to misread as sociability. A man working 12 hours at a distance from where he slept could not go home in the middle of the day, and a great many of the rooms he might have gone home to had no oven, no range, and frequently no fire lit before evening, because coal cost money, and there was nobody in the room to benefit from burning it. Cooking for a large part of London was not something the home was equipped to do. So, the city cooked instead. At the top were the chop houses and dining rooms of the City and the Strand, where a clerk could get a plate of meat and a potato and be back at his desk in 20 minutes, and where the price of doing that took a real bite out of what he was paid. Below them were the cook shops, selling a portion of whatever had been in the pot since morning. Below those were the stalls and the trays out on the pavement. The same need ran the entire length of it. Only the room changed. all of it depended on Sunday. Sunday was not a rest day by any law. It was a day when the work stopped because the people who paid for the work stopped. And for most of London, it was the only unbroken block of hours in the week that belonged to the person living them. It was also, and this matters more than it sounds, the day the shopping was done, because wages were paid on Saturday night, and a household with no money until Saturday night could not buy anything until Sunday morning. If you had walked down a shopping street at 10 on a Sunday, you would have found it busier than at any other hour of the week. In 1855, a bill came before Parliament to stop that. Lord Robert Grosvenor's Sunday Trading Bill would have shut the shops and the beer houses and halted the public transport on the Sabbath in the interests of the Sabbath. The response did not come from a party or a union. It came from handbills. In the week before Sunday, the 24th of June, printed bills went up across the poorer districts, signed by somebody describing himself as a ratepayer of Walworth, calling on the artisans, the mechanics, and the lower orders of the metropolis to come to Hyde Park and see how religiously the aristocracy observed the Sabbath. They came. Along the carriage drives between the Serpentine and Kensington Gardens, the crowds lined up and hooted and hissed at the carriages going by. Carriages driven by servants who were working, carrying people to nothing in particular, on the day whose protection was the entire point of the bill. There were shouts of "Go to church." Horses shied and bolted in the traces. The Sundays that followed were larger. On the 1st of July, by some accounts, there were 150,000 people in the park. Grosvenor withdrew the bill. The objection was never to Sunday. Very few people in those crowds were arguing against the Sabbath, and a good number of them had been in a church or a chapel that morning before walking up to the park. What they were objecting to was a Sabbath legislated by people whose own observance of it amounted to being driven around a park by somebody who was not being permitted to observe it at all. Among those who walked up there that June and then went home and wrote about it was a man in 2 rooms on Dean Street, 5 years into the tenancy, filing copy to a newspaper in Germany because that was the market open to him. Karl Marx had his account of the crowd in print within days of standing in it. What makes the dispatch useful is not the byline. It is that so little else survives from inside that crowd at all. Almost everything we have about the Hyde Park Sundays comes from Parliament, from the newspapers, and from the magistrates, which is to say, from the carriages. This is one of the very few descriptions written by somebody who was standing on the grass. What the beer house and the gin palace and the coffee stall and the chop house had in common was not principally the drink or the food. They were rooms that were neither home nor work, warm, lit, full of other people requiring no invitation and no account of yourself, available for the price of the smallest thing on the list. A city that housed a very large number of its people, one family to a room had to put the rest of their lives somewhere. We have not stopped needing that. The room is better lit now, and the drink is more expensive, and it is still, quite often, the room and not the drink that is being bought. And then it closes, or the money goes, and the walk home is short. At the end of it, there is a room with a table in it, and on the table is whatever there is. In the early 1850s, 24 loaves were bought from bakers' shops across the city. In Covent Garden, in Marylebone, in Whitechapel, carried to a laboratory and put under a microscope. All 24 had alum in them. Bread was on nearly every table in London at nearly every meal, and for a working household it was not one food among several. It was the base of the diet, and the thing everything else was spread on or eaten beside. Alum is a mineral salt, it is not a poison, and the bakers using it were not attempting to injure anybody. What it does to a loaf is make it whiter and firmer, which matters because white bread carried status, and because a firm loaf holds its shape and looks fresh for longer, and because, most usefully of all to a baker, alum makes inferior flour behave like better flour. About 1.5 ounces of it went into a 4-pound loaf. What it also does, which nobody selling it mentioned, is interfere with digestion. A person eating alum in their bread absorbed less from everything else on the plate, which means the households eating the most bread, because bread was what they could afford, were the households getting the least out of what they ate. The reaction that produces is not really outrage or not first. What arrives first is smaller and more domestic. The drop that comes on reading that something you have been buying for years, and eating, and handing across a table to people you are responsible for, had something in it that you were never told about. That is roughly what happened in London when the results began appearing, except that it happened to a couple of million people at once. The method behind the finding was almost aggressively simple. Somebody had decided that the way to establish what was in London's food was to go out and buy it, anonymously over the counter at ordinary shops, as an ordinary customer, and then carry it home and take it apart. Between 1851 and 1854, this was done to several thousand samples of the things Londoners of every class were eating and drinking: bread, flour, coffee, tea, milk, and medicines. The results were printed in The Lancet, a medical journal edited by Thomas Wockley, under the name of the Analytical Sanitary Commission, and they were printed with the names and addresses of the shops. That is the part worth stopping on, because it was not a small editorial decision. Every trader named in those columns could read his own address in a national journal beside a statement of what he had been selling, and every one of them could sue. The threat of a libel action was the standing reason nobody had ever done this before. Reformers had been writing about adulteration for decades in the General, that it was widespread, that it was scandalous, that something ought to be done. And the General is perfectly safe, because the General has no address. The Lancet published the addresses for 4 years. The chief analyst was Arthur Hill Hassell, and in 1855 he was given the right to republish the whole series under his own name, which he did through Longman as Food and Its Adulterations. The immediate effect on the trade was not large. The eventual effect was very large indeed. It took until 1860 for Parliament to legislate on the adulteration of food and drink, and the act that finally arrived was a weak one. But the principle had been put somewhere it could not be taken back from. That what was in food was a question of fact, that facts could be established by testing, and that the answer could be attached to the name of whoever had sold it. Everything downstream of that is recognizable. Inspection as a public activity rather than a private complaint. Findings published rather than negotiated. A rating in a window that a customer can read before deciding to go in. What Hassall did was not discover alum, which a good many people had already suspected. What he did was decide that the finding belonged to the public and should be printed with the address on it. The popular account of Victorian adulteration is full of poison: red lead, copper, strychnine. And there were prosecutions across the century that give some of that a foundation. The picture the analyses actually produced is duller and considerably worse. None of it looked like crime from the inside. It was bulking, everywhere, constantly, at every level of the trade, and mostly with substances that would not kill anyone. Cheap material went into expensive material because it could, and because nobody could see it, and because the customer had no means of checking and no standing to complain. That was simply how the food trade worked, and it worked that way because there was nothing in existence to make it work otherwise. Coffee is the case that shows the shape of the argument. Coffee sold in London was routinely cut with chicory, and when sellers were challenged on it, a great many of them neither denied it nor apologized. Chicory, they said, was not an adulterant. It was an ingredient. People liked it. It was in the coffee because coffee was better with it in. That dispute, whether a thing is contamination or a recipe, is the whole modern argument about food labelling, arriving fully formed over a London counter 170 years ago, and it has never been settled since. The loaf itself was a standard object. Bread was sold as the quartern loaf, made from 3.5 pounds of flour, and coming out at somewhere around 4.33 pounds finished, and it was bought by that name in every district of the city. A labouring man might eat 2 pounds of bread in a day. His wife and his children, between them, would have something over half that. That distribution was not cruelty, and it was not thoughtlessness. It was arithmetic, and every person in the room understood the arithmetic. The man's body was the household's entire income, and a man who could not lift at the dock gate on Tuesday because he had not eaten on Monday put every one of them into the street. Feeding him first was the rational allocation of a scarce resource, and it was carried out, week after week, by the women who were eating least. Around the bread went potatoes, and tea, and when it was possible, bacon. The American sort had come in cheap at 4p to 6p the pound, about half the price of the English, and it was still beyond a man in irregular work. Tea was expensive and was drunk weak and was stretched a long way. That is the diet, not the poorest version of it, or a bad week's version of it. That is what a very large part of London ate, every day, for years, which leaves the week itself and the machine at the centre of it. Wages came on Saturday night. By Monday morning, in an enormous number of households, they had gone on rent, on the week's food, on coal, on whatever had broken or fallen ill. So on Monday morning, the good clothes went to the pawnbroker, not the working clothes. The Sunday ones, the coat, the shawl, the boots, the one decent dress, sometimes a watch, sometimes a wedding ring, sometimes the flat iron, sometimes the tools a man needed for the trade he would be doing on Tuesday. They were pledged for what they would fetch, which was less than they were worth, and that money carried the household to the end of the week. On Saturday night, the wages came in and the clothes came out, redeemed with interest on top. On Sunday they were worn to church, which was the entire point of owning them. On Monday morning they went back. Saturdays and Mondays were the two busiest days a pawnbroker had, and there were streets in this city carrying more pawnbrokers than public houses. If you have ever arranged a week around when money arrives rather than around when things are due, you know the shape of it. It is worth being precise about what that particular cycle was, though, because it does not look like borrowing, and it was not experienced as debt. It was a storage system with a charge attached. A household with no savings and no credit had exactly one asset it could turn into cash at short notice, which was the clothing it owned, and the pawnbroker was the only institution in London willing to make that conversion for a person with no security and no name. The charge fell every single week, so a household running the cycle bought its own coat back over and over for years, paying a fee each time and never once got ahead. Because getting ahead would have required holding a full week's money in reserve, and holding a week's money in reserve was precisely the thing the cycle existed to prevent. The price of bread was, for that reason, a subject of permanent conversation in this city, in the way that the price of one specific ordinary thing still becomes the number everybody has an opinion about. Not because anyone finds it interesting, because it is the figure that tells a household what sort of month is coming. And on the same street, in the same week, one household was running that cycle and the household beside it was not. Both of them worked. Both were paid on Saturday night. The difference between them was not effort, and it was not thrift, and every person living on that street could have named it. They could have named it, and so can we. But naming it is less useful than walking it, because in this city the whole arrangement was laid out on the ground and it could be crossed on foot in about a minute and a half. Take one of the terraces going up west of the parks. At the front is a row of houses in stucco, 4 or 5 stories, with railings and an area below the pavement and a flight of steps to a door with a fan light over it. Behind the row, running parallel to it and reached through an arch, is the mews, a narrow lane with stabling at ground level and rooms above the stables where the coachman lives with his family and the grooms sleep. The distance from a first-floor window at the front to a window over the stables at the back is, in a good many of these developments, under 100 yards. 90 seconds if the arch is open. Nobody walked it. Not socially, and not in either direction. The two ends of that 90 seconds were in daily physical contact. The coachman brought the carriage round, the family got into it, every person involved knew every other person's name. And they occupied positions so far apart that the geography between them was beside the point. That is the shape of London class in the 1850s, and it is the part hardest to reconstruct from here, because the separation was not yet spatial. It became spatial later, once the railways let the comfortable move outward and leave the city to the people who could not follow. In 1851 there was nowhere much to move to. A square of very expensive houses had a rookery 3 streets behind it, and the people from the rookery walked past its railings every morning. The one thing that might have pulled those two populations apart was transport, and transport was priced out of reach. Omnibuses crossed the city, and they were not for the poor. The fare assumed a passenger who did not have to think about the fare, which meant the overwhelming majority of Londoners walked daily in both directions, in whatever weather and over whatever distance, which produced a sum anybody alive now will recognise on sight. Living near the work costs more in rent. Living further out costs less in rent and more in fare, or more in hours, or both. Every household in this city ran that calculation, and for most of them, it came out the way it still comes out, which is that the walk is cheaper than the alternative. So the walk is what happens. The rungs of the ladder above them were marked with a precision that is easy to underestimate, and one of the places they were marked was a tax return. Income tax in this period was assessed on incomes above £150 a year. That figure had been settled by the Treasury for reasons of revenue and had nothing whatever to do with sociology, and it became, almost at once, the line that determined whether a household was middle class. The state drew a boundary in order to collect money, and the country adopted it as a description of itself. Below the line were clerks, shopmen, small tradesmen, the better-paid artisans, and an enormous number of people whose position was a great deal more precarious than their appearance suggested. Above it, rising in stages that any Londoner could recite without hesitating, came the professions, the merchants, the manufacturers, the gentry with land, and finally a few hundred families whose income arrived without anyone in them doing anything. Between £100 and £300 a year, a household could keep a servant, or possibly 2. And that, not the income, which was private, but the servant, who was visible, was how the line got read from outside. The reading was not subtle, and a fair amount of it is still legible. Walk any surviving terrace of that date and the gradations are there in the brickwork and the door cases. The houses at the good end are wider by a window, and the ones at the cheap end have the same facade executed for less money. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable position in the entire structure, occupied by more people every year, and reaching a scale in this decade that had no precedent anywhere. A clerk kept the books, wrote the letters, copied the contracts, and added the columns for a business in which he had no share whatever. What the work asked of him was literacy, a legible hand, accuracy, punctuality, and the appearance of a gentleman. The wages ran from £20 or £25 a year at the beginning to 70 or 80 at the top of an ordinary career. A skilled London coachmaker in a good week could earn at a rate well above the upper end of that, and a great many artisans did. The difference was that the coachmaker went to work in the clothes he owned. A clerk could not. The position required a black coat, a tall hat, and clean linen. And clean linen means a shirt front and a collar, presentable every single day, which means laundry every single day, which is either a wife's hands in hot water before 6 in the morning or money leaving the house every week. The coat had to be brushed, the boots had to be blacked, the hat had to be kept. None of it was negotiable because the whole of his value to the firm was that he looked like the sort of person a customer would trust with an account. So a man earning £70 a year was under a standing obligation to look like a man earning 300, and the cost of managing it came out of the 70. That is a deduction which never appears as a deduction. It is not taken off the wage, it is not itemized anywhere, and nobody at the time or since has called it a cost of employment. It is simply the sum a person has to lay out in order to go on being the kind of person who can hold the job, and it falls hardest on whoever has the least room to lay anything out. The lower the position, the larger the proportion, and the more relentless the upkeep. Anyone who has held a post with a standard of appearance attached and a salary that did not comfortably fund it knows both the arithmetic and the particular tiredness that comes with it. At the other end of all this, the year had a shape. Parliament sat and the families who counted came to London for it, and the season ran from about May until the middle of August. It finished on a fixed date for a reason that had nothing to do with Parliament, the 12th of August, when shooting opened on the grouse moors, and the houses in Belgravia and Mayfair emptied inside a week. Something like 15 weeks. Inside those weeks, the dressmakers worked through the nights. The job masters who hired out horses and carriages got rates they could not get at any other time of year. The florists and confectioners and musicians took the bulk of their annual income, and households engaged extra servants by the month. Then it stopped, and everybody in that economy had to reach the following May on what the 15 weeks had produced. Seen from below, the season was a seasonal trade, with every property a seasonal trade has, including the one where the work is intense and well paid, finishes on a known date, and does not come back until it comes back. There is one further thing here that the documents cannot quite show, and it is the language. The period had an enormous vocabulary for these gradations, and almost all of it was moral, respectable, decent, steady, rough, low. In the official reports, there was a further set of terms for the people at the very bottom, and they carried the sense of sediment, of what is left in the bottom of the vessel once everything usable has been drawn off. Every one of those words describes an economic position while sounding like a description of a character. A man in regular weekly work was respectable, and a man waiting at a dock gate was rough, and the difference between them was whether a foreman had pointed at him that morning. The vocabulary took a set of accidents and made them look like a set of qualities, and it did the job so efficiently that a good deal of it is still in circulation. Most of those terraces are standing. So are most of the mews behind them, though the stables were converted long ago and are now among the more expensive addresses in the city, which is a joke the 1850s would not have found funny. The arch is still an arch. The lane runs where it ran. You can walk it, and it still takes about 90 seconds. What has gone is the arrangement it existed to serve. At the front of the house, dinner was at 7 or 8 in the evening, and it got later as the century went on because dining late was itself a way of saying that this was not a household obliged to be up early, which was true of the household and true of nobody else under that roof. For a dinner to reach that table at that hour, in a house where every drop of hot water had to be carried up by hand and every dish came off a coal range, somebody had to have been awake since 5. 14 hours separate 5 in the morning from that dinner, and for one household in this city, we have every one of them. That is the extraordinary part, because almost never do we have any of them at all. There are 17 notebooks. They were kept between 1854 and 1873, which is 19 years, and they are not a journal in the sense the word usually carries. There is very little feeling in them and almost no reflection. What they hold day after day after day is an account of what was done, in the order it was done, set down at the end of the day by the person who did it. The hand is Hannah Culwick's. She was born in 1833, and across her working life she was a maid of all work, a scullion, and a pot girl, which are 3 names for positions at the bottom of a system that contained a great many positions. That system was the largest employer of women in the country and one of the largest employers of anybody at all. At the census of 1851, there were over 1 million domestic servants in Britain, the second commonest occupation in the whole country, behind agricultural labour and ahead of everything else, including the textile mills that have taken most of the attention since. Something like 43% of adult women were recorded as employed, and the greater share of them were in service, which makes service the likeliest single answer to the question of what an Englishwoman did with her days. And it is, almost in its entirety, undocumented, because the people doing it were not the people who wrote things down. Her particular position needs defining, because the word servant covers an enormous range and gets flattened in the telling. A large establishment divided the work up. There was a cook and a kitchen maid beneath her, and a scullery maid beneath her again, a housemaid, a parlour maid, a lady's maid, a nurse, a footman, a butler, a coachman, a groom. Each had a defined sphere and a rank, and the hierarchy below stairs was observed with a good deal more rigour than anything going on above it. A household on £200 or £300 a year had none of that. It had a girl. She was called the maid of all work, and the phrase means precisely what it says. Everything the large house divided among 8 or 10 people she did, by herself, in a smaller house, for less money. It was the commonest position in service and the hardest, and it was where most girls began and where a great many of them remained. What that day consisted of can be reconstructed with reasonable confidence, and it is worth being clear that reconstruction is what it is. What follows comes from the general record of the work rather than from any single page, and it is offered as the shape of a day and not as anybody's particular Tuesday. She is up at 5 in the dark for half the year. Nothing in the house can begin until there is fire, so the kitchen range comes first. Rake out yesterday's ash, carry it away, lay the new fire, light it, and then wait, because a cold range takes time to come up, and everything else in the day is waiting behind it. Then the grates in the rooms the family will use, raked out, the ash carried down, the iron blacked and rubbed up until it shines, laid again, lit, so that when the first member of the household comes downstairs, there is a fire already burning in the room and no evidence anywhere of how it arrived. Then the front step, scrubbed, on her knees, in the street, before the house is awake. The step is the first thing any passerby sees, and it is read as a statement about the household inside. A dozen of them were out at 6 in the morning along any given street, one to a house, all on their knees at the same hour doing the same thing, and nobody going past gave it a second's thought, because there was nothing there to think about. After the step, the boots blacked, the knives cleaned, and the water carried. All of it in cans up the stairs, because there is no supply above the ground floor, and there will not be one for another generation. Then breakfast, and the washing up from breakfast, and the beds and the slops carried down and out, and the rooms swept, and the range cleaned a second time, and the dinner begun and cooked and carried up and served and cleared and washed up after. On their own days laid on top of all of it come the laundry and the baking and the ironing. Last thing, once everyone else has gone up, bank the fires, lock the doors, carry the water ready for the morning, and go to bed. If you had come down those stairs at 5:20, you would have found her at the range with her hands black, in a house where every other person was still asleep, and she would have got up off the floor and stood aside and said good morning, and waited for you to pass. The notebooks exist for a reason that has to be stated plainly, because leaving it out would make the record look cleaner than it is. She wrote them because a man asked her to. Arthur Munby was a barrister and a poet with a lifelong and not at all straightforward preoccupation with working women. He met Hannah Culwick in 1854 and asked her to keep a record of her days, and she kept it for 19 years. The two of them eventually married, in secret. The relationship documented across her pages and his own is strange enough that a great deal has been written about it. And none of that is the subject here. What matters for the record is narrower and more uncomfortable than the relationship. The single largest surviving first-hand account of Victorian domestic labour exists because somebody standing outside the work took an interest in it, and the interest was not neutral. That is not unusual. It is closer to a general rule. Almost everything we hold about the lives of the poor in this century survives because a person with money and leisure decided to look, and the looking was hardly ever disinterested. There is no clean version of this archive available to us. The choice was never between a compromised record and a pure one. It was between a compromised record and silence. The papers went to Trinity College, Cambridge, where they are held as the Munby Collection, and the diaries were edited by Liz Stanley and published in 1984, 130 years after the first entry, and 75 years after Hannah Culwick died. What she was paid varied by household and by year, and matters less than the structure of the arrangement, which was this: she lived in the house. There were no hours because the position was not defined by hours. It was defined by availability. A servant was not off-duty in any sense a modern contract would recognize. She was in the building, and if she was in the building, she could be called. Time outside it was not an entitlement but a permission, granted by the mistress, and revocable. Board and lodging counted as part of the payment, which meant that losing the position and losing the roof were the same event, on the same afternoon. And the whole standard by which the work was judged good was that none of it should ever be apparent. A well-run house was a house where the fires were burning and nobody had seen them laid, where the water was hot and nobody had carried it, where the step was white and nobody had knelt on it. The success condition of the labour was its own invisibility, which is exactly why so little of it was ever written down, and exactly why 17 notebooks in one woman's handwriting are worth what they are worth. None of that has gone anywhere. The work that keeps a household upright is still, in most households, done by somebody, and is still noticed chiefly on the days it fails to happen, and is still hardest to put a value on for precisely the reason it is hard to see. She finishes the step at about 6:30, and it dries, and the household comes down to it without looking at it. A few summers before the first of those notebooks was opened, they had put up a building in Hyde Park, made almost entirely out of the one material on Earth that shows every mark on it, and something over 6 million people had walked through it, and not one of them had given that a thought. 6,039,000, near enough across 141 days. That is the figure everybody quotes, and it is the least useful thing about the exhibition, because a number of that size says nothing at all about who came. The useful information is in the calendar because the place kept time by price. For the first 2 days, a ticket cost £1. For the 3 weeks after that, 5 shillings. And then, from the 26th of May, the week took on a shape it held until October, a shilling on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday, half a crown on Friday, 5 shillings on Saturday, which means the building held 4 different populations depending on the day of the week, and every person in London understood the arrangement without anyone having to explain it. There were days that were yours and days that were not, and the difference was legible from the far end of the street, in the clothes on the crowd going in at the doors. 2/3 of the 6 million came on a shilling, something over 4.5 million people. The approach of the 26th of May was watched with an anxiety that is hard to take seriously now, and was completely serious then. 3 years earlier, the Chartists had assembled on Kennington Common, and the government had prepared for that morning as though for an insurrection. The year before, half the capitals of Europe had gone up. The memory was very fresh, and a large number of people in London expected the shilling days to end in a riot. The Times set the expectation down in a phrase. Once the aristocratic element retired, it said, "King Mob enters." What happened on the 26th of May was that a great many people came in, walked about looking at things, and went home. They went on doing it for 4.5 months. No riot came. Nothing anybody had predicted came. The forecasts had been wrong in a particular and instructive way. They had assumed that a working population assembled in one place would behave as a mob, because a mob was what the word crowd had come to mean to the people doing the forecasting. Getting there was the harder problem, and it was solved by the railways and by one man in particular. Joseph Paxton went to a temperance campaigner and printer in Leicester who had been running cheap excursion trains for about a decade and asked him to bring the North and the Midlands down to London. Thomas Cook took it on with something close to mania. Between June and October, he barely spent a night at home. He brought out a newspaper of his own to advertise the trips, called Cook's Exhibition Herald, an excursion advertiser, and by the end of the season, he had moved 150,000 people into London and out again. His last trains carried 3,000 children from Leicester and Nottingham and Derby. Everything about that arrangement is recognisable. A single site, a fixed run of dates, a tiered price with a cheap day in it, transport chartered specially and sold alongside the ticket, a promotional paper produced to fill the carriages, and a whole apparatus for moving an enormous number of people to one place and back on a schedule. The modern version has better trains and worse crowds. The structure is the same structure, and it was put together here, more or less out of nothing in one summer. What they came to see is harder to summarise than it ought to be, because the contents were vast and are largely uncatalogued in memory. The building did most of the work. It was iron and glass on a scale nobody had attempted, and it went up so fast and came down so cleanly that it read to visitors as a kind of trick. Inside the transept, standing in their own soil, were full-grown elm trees out of the park, which Paxton had roofed over rather than cut down. Beside them stood a fountain of cut glass 27 feet high. The elms brought their sparrows in with them, and the sparrows declined to leave. And what to do about several hundred birds loose inside a glass building full of textiles became a real administrative problem. The story that survives is that the Queen mentioned it to the Duke of Wellington, and that the Duke said, "Sparrowhawks, ma'am." It is usually repeated as fact, and is more accurately described as reputed, which is a distinction worth keeping hold of. If you have ever gone to something enormous intending to see all of it, you know what happened next. People arrived with a plan, and the plan met the size of the place, and by the middle of the afternoon, they were walking past entire nations without turning their heads. For most of the 6 million, the Great Exhibition was one very long day on their feet inside a building they could not get to the end of. And the single most heavily used facility in it was not an exhibit at all. In the retiring rooms, a sanitary engineer named George Jennings had installed flushing water closets, 22 on the men's side and 47 on the women's. The urinals were free. The closets cost a penny, and the penny bought a clean seat, a clean towel, a comb, and a shine on the boots. Across the 141 days, 827,280 people paid it. Jennings talked the organisers into keeping them open after the exhibition closed, and they went on earning him over £1,000 a year. The expression that came out of them has outlasted the building, the exhibits, and the empire being celebrated. People still say they are going to spend a penny. That figure is worth holding up against everything already established about how this city lived. In a court where every household shared one privy at the far end of the yard, a clean lavatory with a towel and a comb beside it was not a convenience. It was worth a penny in its own right, and 800,000 people agreed, and a fair number of them will have gone home and described it. There is one more building in this story, and where it stood is the entire point of it. Prince Albert was president of a body called the Society for Improving the Conditions of the Labouring Classes, and he wanted the exhibition to show what decent housing for working people might look like. An architect named Henry Roberts designed a block of 4 flats to demonstrate it, hollow bricks that resisted damp and carried less sound, a scullery, and a lavatory inside each dwelling. The exhibition commissioners refused to have it on the grounds. A display of what the nation could manufacture was not, in their judgment, the place for an exhibit about how the nation housed the people doing the manufacturing. With Albert's intervention, a compromise was reached, and the model dwellings went up just outside the fence, on the ground of the cavalry barracks at Knightsbridge. More than 250,000 people walked out there to look at them. The design was given one of the 170 council medals, which were the exhibition's highest award. And in 1852, it was taken down and rebuilt in Kennington Park, where it stands today, the only structure from the Great Exhibition surviving anywhere in the world. You can go and look at it. It costs nothing, and there is rarely anybody else there. The doors shut to the public on the 11th of October, and the exhibition formally ended on the 15th. The largest single day had come the week before. 109,915 people through the turnstiles on the 7th. The building came down, went out to Sydenham, and was standing again by 1854. The profit came to £186,000, and it was spent on land and institutions in South Kensington that are still open, which means a good deal of what people now walk into free of charge was paid for out of shilling tickets. And what was actually demonstrated across those 141 days had very little to do with manufacturing. 6 million people had been assembled in one place and sent home again, without anything happening at all. For the men who had spent May expecting a rising, that was the result of the whole enterprise. Those men numbered a few hundred. They sat about 1.5 miles to the east, in a building that was also new and was also not finished, It had been going up for 17 years by then, and it would go on going up for another 18. The old Palace of Westminster had burned in 1834, and what was rising in its place was the largest building project in the country. There was a man in the City of London who had been elected to sit in it and could not get through the door. He had been returned as one of the 4 members for the city in 1847. His constituents knew precisely what they had done, and they did it again at the next opportunity, and again after that. What stopped him was not a rule about who could stand, and not a rule about who could be elected. It was the wording at the end of the oath every member had to swear before taking his seat, which finished with the phrase, "on the true faith of a Christian." He was Jewish. He would not swear it, and the House would not seat him without it. And so for 11 years, the largest and wealthiest constituency in England returned a member to Parliament who was not permitted into the chamber. The building is still there, and the door is still a door. And what held him on the wrong side of it for over a decade was a sentence of 7 words that nobody says anymore. The Commons passed relief bills more than once. The Lords threw them out more than once. What eventually broke the deadlock in 1858 was not an argument about religious liberty at all, but a procedural concession. The Jews' Relief Act allowed each house to settle the form of its own oath, which let the Commons quietly drop the phrase for anybody who could not say it. On the 26th of July, 1858, Lionel de Rothschild came in with his head covered, swore on the Old Testament, and closed the oath with the words, "So help me, Jehovah." Then he sat down, and that was more or less the whole of it. He is not recorded as having made much use of the seat, and he seldom spoke in it. The 11 years had been spent establishing that he was entitled to be in a particular room, and once he was in the room, there was not a great deal left to do. That was the assembly. It is worth being exact about how few people had any part in choosing it. The Reform Act of 1832 is remembered as the Great Widening, and it did widen things, and what it widened them to was something like 1 adult man in 5 in England and Wales. In the boroughs, the qualification was occupation of a house worth £10 a year, which sounds modest and excluded almost every working man in London, because almost every working man in London occupied a room and not a house. No women at any level, under any qualification. So the men in that chamber had been chosen by about 1/5 of the men in the country, and were governing all of them, and were also governing everybody that 1/5 did not include. There had been a movement about exactly this, and it had ended 3 years before our morning. The Chartists had wanted, among other things, the vote for every man, a secret ballot, and payment for members so that a man without money could afford to sit. In 1848, they assembled on Kennington Common to present a petition, and the government met them with a scale of preparation that made its own point, and the movement declined afterwards and never recovered. Which leaves a question the record answers badly. What did the ordinary population of this city actually think about being governed by people they had no hand in selecting? We have the parliamentary debates, which are the enfranchised talking to one another. We have the newspapers, which were owned by the enfranchised. We have petitions which tell us what organised people wanted, and nothing whatever about anybody else. What we do not have, in any quantity, is the opinion of a man with no vote on the subject of having no vote, because nobody was collecting it, and he was not writing it down. The political quiet of the 1850s is usually read as contentment. It may have been. It may equally have been exhaustion, or the ordinary fact that a person working 12 hours a day has limited time for constitutional theory. The record does not settle it, and saying so is more honest than choosing. In any case, Parliament was not the thing that governed most people's lives. The parish did. The The vestry was the unit of real administration in London. It paved and lit and cleansed the streets, levied the poor rate, ran the burial ground, and before the police existed, it had run the watch. There were dozens of them with different boundaries and different powers, and wildly different competence, and a Londoner's practical experience of being governed was very largely a matter of which parish he happened to live in. They were elected on a property qualification of their own. A good number were corrupt, and a larger number were simply swamped by a population arriving faster than anybody could rate it. What changed in this decade is that London acquired a government at all. An Act of 1855 created the Metropolitan Board of Works, a body drawn from the vestries and district boards rather than elected directly by anyone, which is a peculiar constitutional object, and was the only one that could command agreement. It was the first authority with the whole metropolis inside its remit, and within a year it had appointed a chief engineer. The chamber itself had been settled by competition. 97 designs were submitted for the rebuilding, and the winners were Charles Barry and Augustus Pugin, working in a Gothic manner that reached back deliberately across 400 years. The Queen opened the new palace in 1852. Pugin died that same year, at 40. Barry died in 1860. Neither of them saw the thing completed. There is something worth noticing in that choice of style. At the exact moment this country was assembling the most modern city on earth out of iron and plate glass and steam, it was rebuilding the seat of its own authority in the architecture of the 15th century. Because authority, went the argument, ought to look old. The clock was ordered in 1852. The great bell was cast in 1856 and cracked under testing the following year. A second was cast at the Whitechapel Bell Foundry in April of 1858 and brought across the city to New Palace Yard on a carriage drawn by 16 white horses. It acquired a nickname whose origin has never been established to anybody's satisfaction, and it has been striking the hour over that river ever since. You have heard it. Almost everybody has, without ever having stood anywhere near it. The reach of that chamber ran a good deal further than the parishes. For most of this decade, a territory containing a substantial part of Asia was governed neither by the Crown nor directly by Parliament, but by a chartered company with an office in the City of London. The East India Company's rule was ended in 1858 and transferred to the Crown by Act, after the rebellion of the year before, which means that through most of the 1850s, one of the largest administrations on earth was, on paper, a business. The mechanism that kept Rothschild standing outside for 11 years was not an exotic one. No law said he could not sit. What stood in the way was a form of words that everybody had to repeat, drafted long before anyone imagined he might need to repeat it, and left in place because taking it out would have required somebody to bother. That is how most exclusions work. Very few of them announce themselves. They sit in the procedure, in the wording, in the qualification that reads as neutral until it is held up against who is actually in the room, and they last for years after everyone involved has stopped meaning them, because the effort of removing a phrase is always greater than the effort of leaving it alone. The new palace was built along the bank of the river, with a terrace running the whole length of it directly above the water, and members walked out there between divisions to take the air. For most of the decade, it was possible to do that without thinking about what was underneath. What was underneath was the river, and what was in the river was everything. The Thames through central London in the 1850s was functioning in every practical sense as the city's main drain. An open channel taking the outflow of a population approaching 2.5 million and running up and down twice a day with the tide. That last part is the part that matters. What went into the water at Westminster did not go out to sea. It went downstream as far as the ebb carried it, and then it came back. Everybody has had the experience of a smell they cannot get away from, and the strange thing about it is how completely it defeats reasoning. You can know perfectly well that a smell is harmless, and it does not help in the slightest. The body treats a bad smell as information, and goes on treating it as information for as long as it lasts, which is worth holding on to because it explains the whole medical position of this period. The men trying to keep London alive believed that the smell was the danger, that disease moved through the air, rising off drains and graveyards and standing water, and reaching people through the atmosphere. It is easy to be superior about that from here. It was a theory built on the most reliable instinct the human body has. Before any of it reached the river, it sat under the house. The standard arrangement across London was a cesspool, a brick chamber roughly 6 feet deep and 4 across, dug under or beside the building and taking everything from the privy above. It was connected to nothing. It filled slowly over months, and when it was full, somebody came and took the contents away. The men who did that were called nightmen because the law required them to work in the hours of darkness, on the reasoning that the operation was less objectionable if nobody could see it happening. It was not a full-time occupation. Dustmen and labourers and bricklayers took it on for extra money, arriving with buckets and a cart in the small hours, emptying the chamber by hand, and carrying the load out of the city, which is the part usually left out. It went to the market gardens. The land on every side of London was manured with what London produced, and the produce came back into the markets and was eaten, and the loop closed. It was not sanitary, and it was not agreeable, and for a very long time it functioned because the volumes stayed inside what the system could carry. What broke it was an improvement. The flushing water closet was a real advance in domestic life, and across the first half of the 1850s, the number of them in London roughly doubled. Anybody who could afford one put one in, and every person who did so was acting correctly by every standard the period possessed. Each of those closets was plumbed into a cesspool that had been dug to hold solids. A chamber built to take one household's waste across 6 months was now taking the same waste plus several gallons of water every time somebody pulled a handle. It overflowed into the ground, into neighbouring cellars, and, wherever a house had been connected to one of the old surface drains, straight out into the sewers. Those sewers had been built to carry rainwater off the streets. They ran to the river, so the net effect of a decade of sanitary improvement, undertaken in good faith by careful people, was to lift the city's excrement out of the ground beneath its houses and deliver it into the water the city drank. The supply itself was in private hands. Several companies serving different districts, all drawing from the same river, and some of them taking their water from stretches of the Thames, below the points where the sewers came out. The distinction between the supply and the sewage was, in those cases, a few hundred yards and the direction of the tide. Parliament legislated on it in 1852. The Metropolis Water Act required the companies to filter through slow sand beds and to cover their reservoirs, and, in the clause that counted, to stop drawing from the tidal river altogether. From the 31st of August 1855, it was unlawful for any company supplying London to take water from the Thames below Teddington Lock. What arrived at the far end of the pipe was another matter, since the supply still came on for a few hours on certain days and had to be stored in whatever the household possessed until the next time. And then there was a hot summer. June of 1858 was unusually warm and stayed warm through into August. The river dropped. What lay exposed along the banks at low water, down the whole length of central London, was the accumulated deposit of everything that had been going into it for 30 years in full sun. The Palace of Westminster stands on that bank, and its terrace runs directly above the water. The house attempted to carry on working. Committee rooms on the riverfront were abandoned. Curtains and blinds were soaked in chloride of lime and hung across the windows, which achieved very little. Members went about the corridors with handkerchiefs held over their faces, and a good number of them concluded, on the evidence of their own noses, that they were being poisoned where they sat. What happened next is either the most damning fact in this decade or the most encouraging one, and it repays sitting with rather than settling quickly. The condition of the Thames had been reported on for years. Royal commissions had examined it. Engineers had submitted schemes. The Metropolitan Board of Works had a chief engineer with a finished plan and no money to build it, and the reason there was no money was that paying for it meant levying a rate. And levying a rate meant a quarrel about which parishes and which classes would carry the cost. That quarrel had run on, unresolved for the better part of a decade, while the evidence accumulated in official reports that anybody could read and nobody acted on. In the summer of 1858, the members of Parliament could smell the problem from their own benches. Disraeli brought in a bill. It went through both houses and received the royal assent in 18 days. 18 days. It is hard not to read that as a straightforward indictment, and the straightforward reading is very largely correct. A legislature that had ignored a public health emergency for 15 years moved inside 3 weeks of being personally inconvenienced by it. There is a second thing in the same fact, though, and it is uncomfortable in a different direction. 18 days is what that institution was capable of. The capacity had been sitting there the entire time. What had been missing was not the machinery, or the plan, or the evidence, or even the money, which proved perfectly findable once anybody wanted to find it. The missing item was the will, and the will arrived on a warm morning through an open window. The engineer with the plan was Joseph Bazalgette, appointed to the Metropolitan Board of Works in 1856, 2 years before the money existed. What he built was not a sewer in the ordinary sense. It was an interception. Rather than attempting to replace the drains already running down to the Thames, he laid enormous new sewers across the line of them, running west to east and parallel to the river, catching each outfall before it could discharge and carrying the whole flow away downstream, out past the built city, to be let go on the ebb well below the point where anyone was living. It took years. The Act passed in 1858, and the system was not substantially finished until the 1870s, and Bazalgette spent the remainder of his working life on it. Most of what he laid is still carrying. If you have used a lavatory anywhere in central London, you have used something that man drew. The part usually left out of the story is that the summer which finally paid for it lasted about 6 weeks. There is nothing peculiarly Victorian in that sequence, and it is not really a story about drains. A problem gets documented. It is reported on, and the reports are accurate, and they are read by people who are not experiencing it. Nothing happens. And the nothing is not malice. It is the ordinary friction of cost and jurisdiction, and the plain fact that the people holding the authority to act are insulated from the consequences of not acting. Then the insulation fails, for reasons that have nothing to do with the merits of the case, and the thing that was impossible for 15 years is completed in 3 weeks. The summer of 1858 is not really evidence about Victorian hypocrisy. What it is evidence about is proximity. That proximity is the thing which moves institutions, and that everything upstream of it, the evidence and the argument and the expertise and the plain description of other people's suffering, is a great deal weaker than anybody would like. And there is one more thing in it that nobody in that building could have known while they stood at the windows with handkerchiefs to their faces. They were wrong about the smell. The stench coming off the river that summer was foul, and it was not the thing killing people, and the proof of that had already been assembled 4 years earlier, about a mile to the north, by one physician standing in a small street in Soho, counting the households that had been drinking from a particular well. 17 months before he stood in that street, the same man had been in a bedroom at Buckingham Palace, holding a folded handkerchief over the face of the Queen of England. It was the 7th of April, 1853, and Victoria was delivering her 8th child. The handkerchief was soaked in chloroform, and he gave it to her in small measured doses, on a schedule he had calculated himself, so that she was relieved of the worst of the pain without being put under. There had been a great deal of objection to anesthesia in childbirth, some medical and some theological, the theological argument being that the pain was scriptural and therefore intended. The objection did not survive the Queen. Within a very short time the practice was ordinary, and it was known by her name. John Snow was, by the standards of his profession, an unusual kind of doctor, and the unusual thing about him was that he measured. Most medicine of the period ran on judgment and experience and authority. Snow ran on quantities. His anesthetic work had grown out of a conviction that the safe way to administer an invisible agent was to know precisely how much of it was in the air, and he had built apparatus and done arithmetic to find out, at a time when most practitioners were pouring chloroform onto a cloth and watching the patient's face. That habit is the whole of what follows. He was a man who counted in a decade when very few people in medicine did. What he was counting against was the settled and best informed opinion of the age, and it is worth not caricaturing it. The theory was miasma, that epidemic disease moved through the atmosphere, produced by decaying matter and carried on the air. It was held by the sanitary reformers, who were the most energetic and best-intentioned people in the whole of public health. It was held by the General Board of Health. It was held by nearly every physician in the country. And the reason it was so durable is that it kept being confirmed. A theory that says, clear away the filth produces policy that clears away filth, and clearing away filth does reduce disease. It was right about what to do and wrong about why for 30 years, which is among the hardest positions for evidence to shift. The outbreak began on the 31st of August, 1854, in the streets around Broad Street in Soho. It moved faster than anything in the city's memory. In the first 3 days, 127 people died on or immediately around that one street. Within 10 days, the figure had gone past 500. By the end, it stood at 616. If you had walked into Broad Street in the first week of September, you would have found a street emptying. Shops shut with the stock still on the shelves, families leaving with what they could carry, undertakers working without a break, and most of the houses still occupied had somebody ill inside them. And in the middle of all of it, the pump was still working, and people were still using it, because the water from that pump had a reputation in the neighborhood for being good. People walked to it from other streets. That reputation is a substantial part of the reason the death toll was what it was. What Snow did was go and ask. He obtained the death registrations from the General Register Office, which gave him addresses. He walked the district. He knocked on doors and asked where each household drew its water, and in 61 of the deaths he was told directly that the person had drunk from Broad Street, either constantly or from time to time. Then he drew it. 578 deaths, marked on a plan of Soho as a bar set against the address where each had happened, so that the shape of the outbreak became something a person could look at. The bars thickened as the streets converged on one point and thinned as they ran away from it, and the point was the pump. The strongest part of the argument came from the two places in the middle of the outbreak where almost nobody died. The workhouse stood on Poland Street, well inside the zone, with over 500 people in it, living at a density that miasma theory would have predicted as lethal. 5 of them died. The workhouse had its own well and a supply from a company drawing outside the district, and its inmates had no occasion to walk out to a public pump. On Broad Street itself, there was a brewery. The men working in it drank beer which came to them as part of their wages, and the brewery drew from its own deep bore. Not one of them fell ill. 2 buildings full of people in the centre of the district where the dying was heaviest, and the only thing dividing them from everybody around them was where the water came from. On the evening of Thursday, the 7th of September, Snow put all of it to the Board of Guardians of the parish of St. James's. His own account of what followed runs to a couple of sentences and is entirely without drama. He had an interview with the board, he wrote, and represented the above circumstances to them, and in consequence of what he said, the handle of the pump was removed on the following day. Friday the 8th of September, 1854. Here the story that everybody knows becomes less tidy than the version usually told, in a way Snow himself was careful about. The outbreak was already falling by the 8th. It had peaked days earlier, in part because a very large proportion of the people who used that pump had either died or gone. Taking the handle off did not stop the epidemic, and he never claimed that it had. What it did was put a claim into the world in a form that could be argued with. Somebody had stated in public to a committee that one specific pump was killing people, and had stated it on the basis of counted deaths and mapped addresses rather than on the basis of what the air smelled like. The person who settled the matter was trying to prove the opposite. The curate of St. Luke's in Berwick Street had lived and worked in those streets for years, knew the households in them by name, and did not believe a word of the water explanation. Henry Whitehead set out to show that Snow was mistaken, and he did it the only way available, which was to go through the district house by house and establish what had actually happened inside each one. He was far better placed for it than Snow was. He was known there. Doors opened for him that would not have opened for a physician from another parish, and if he had knocked on yours you would have recognised his face and let him in. What he found at the end of all of it was the beginning. At number 40 Broad Street there was a family called Lewis. On the 24th of August, days before the first cholera death anybody had recorded, their 5-month-old daughter fell ill. Her name was Frances. Her mother, Sarah Lewis, did what any mother in that street would have done. She washed the soiled napkins and she emptied the water into the cesspool at the front of the house. Frances Lewis died on the 2nd of September. The cesspool at the front of number 40 stood under 3 feet from the brickwork of the well, and it was in poor repair. When the ground was eventually opened, the leak was there. Whitehead wrote his findings into a special report, and it was appended to the report that the Parish Cholera Inquiry Committee delivered to the vestry in July of 1855. That committee accepted the pump. Almost nobody else did. Snow had a distribution and an inference. He did not have a mechanism. He could not show what was in the water because the organism that causes cholera was not identified until 1883, 25 years after his death. He was asking his profession to accept a cause that nobody could see, on the strength of arithmetic, against a theory with 30 years of apparent success behind it. The General Board of Health investigated the outbreak and concluded that it had been caused by filth and bad air. There is a particular kind of difficulty in that position, and it has nothing to do with being wrong. It is the difficulty of being right early, of having assembled something true and complete and checkable, and discovering that correctness is only one of the conditions for being believed, and not the one that decides it. The evidence does not argue on its own behalf. The gap between demonstrating a thing and having it accepted is measured in years, and is sometimes measured in whole working lives. 3 streets from that pump, in 2 rooms on Dean Street, a household that had already buried 3 children came through the autumn of 1854 without losing anyone. There is no explanation for it beyond where they happened to fetch their water, and no sign that any of them noticed. Snow died in June of 1858 at 45. It was 6 weeks before the smell off the river became unbearable enough to buy London its sewers, on the strength of a theory he had spent his working life showing to be mistaken. He did not live to see the money spent, and he did not live to see anybody agree with him. Frances Lewis was 5 months old, and she is one of 616. A figure that stands out only because that outbreak was concentrated enough to be counted at all. Most of the dying in this city was never done in epidemics. It was done quietly across every ordinary week of every ordinary year, by the very young. On the counter of almost any chemist's shop in London, and in a great many grocers and general stores besides, there was a bottle that could be bought without a prescription, without a question, and without restriction of any kind. It was sweet. It was flavoured with treacle and spices, and it was advertised for colic, for teething, for griping in the bowels, and for wakefulness in infants. It was sold under a proprietary name that had been in circulation since the previous century. The active ingredient was opium. Godfrey's cordial was the best known of them, and it was nowhere near the only one. There was a whole class of these preparations, sold under different names by different makers, all of them variations on the same formula, all of them entirely legal, and all of them doing precisely what the label undertook to do. That last part is the part to hold on to. It worked. A child given a spoonful stopped crying and went to sleep, reliably, every time, and that is why it sold in the quantities it sold in. The arithmetic behind those quantities has to be set out carefully, because it is very easy to get wrong and very unfair to the people involved. A woman doing outwork in her own room, or standing in a laundry, or at a bench in a small workshop, cannot do that work with an infant awake beside her. She also cannot stop. The household survival is calculated to the shilling, and there is no slack in it for a week without her earnings. And there is nobody to leave the child with. No institution, no nursery, no arrangement of any description, and frequently no relative either, because she has come to London from somewhere else, and her family is 200 miles away. She has one problem with nothing in it that resembles a solution, and there is a bottle on a counter costing a few pence that makes the problem go away for 6 hours. That sum has not gone anywhere. The cost of having somebody mind a child set against the cost of not going to work is a calculation an enormous number of people still run and still lose. What has changed is the range of available answers, and the range of available answers in 1851 was 1. The scale of it is on record, because somebody thought to ask a druggist. In Manchester, one seller admitted to shifting half a gallon of Godfrey's cordial in an ordinary week, alongside 5 or 6 gallons a week of a second preparation which he referred to, without any embarrassment and apparently as the ordinary trade term, as quietness. A physician writing a manual for mothers in 1854, Thomas Bull, whose book was widely read and widely trusted, estimated that 3/4 of all deaths from opium in this country occurred in children under 5 years old. The information was not hidden, and it was not disputed. In 1857, a bill came before Parliament to classify opium and its derivatives as poisons, which would have brought them under control and made them a great deal harder to sell across a counter to anybody who walked in. It failed. The chemists who traded in it lobbied against it, and it did not pass. What the record holds about any of this is uneven in a specific way that is worth naming. We have the death registrations, which give ages and causes. We have the medical manuals, written by men, addressed to the mothers of comfortable households. We have parliamentary papers and evidence taken from chemists, and the reports of inspectors and inquiries and commissions. What we very nearly do not have is children. If you go looking for a child's own account of a London childhood in this decade, you will find almost nothing, and the nothing is not the result of an archive badly kept. Children did not write letters that anybody preserved. They did not sit for interviews. They gave evidence in court occasionally, under conditions that shaped what came out of them. Nobody asked them what they thought about their work or their families or their days, because it did not occur to anyone that the answer would constitute information. The exceptions sit almost entirely in one place: a small number of conversations taken down by a journalist who thought to ask and who wrote the answers as they were given to him. Schooling was not something the state provided. There would be no national system until 1870, and what stood in its place was a patchwork that a family worked through according to what it could pay and what was within walking distance. At the bottom were the dame schools, a woman in her own front room, taking in children for a few pence a week, minding them and teaching letters if she was able, which she often was not. Above those, the national schools run by the Church of England and the British schools run by the nonconformists, funded by subscription and by government grant and charging a small fee. And underneath everything, the ragged schools, which were free and which existed for children too poor or too dirty or too obviously working to be admitted anywhere else. By 1849, there were 82 of them, teaching 11,000 pupils on Sundays and 8,000 in the day. The only measure we have of what came out of it is the mark in the marriage register, and nationally that puts something like 2/3 of men and about half of women able to write their own names. It is a very low bar, and it tells us almost nothing about whether a person could read a page of a newspaper or a set of workhouse rules. Work began early and began gradually. There was no line in a London childhood at which a child stopped being a child and started earning. There was a slope beginning at about 5, when a child could be sent on an errand or set to mind a younger one, and running through the small tasks of a street trade or a workshop or a mother's stitching until, somewhere around 12 or 13, the child was simply working. The popular picture of Victorian child labour is a mill, and for this city it is the wrong picture. Here it was errands and selling and workshops with 4 people in them, and going into service. The Factory Acts had been arriving since the 1830s, and they regulated hours in textile manufacture. They did not reach a workshop. They certainly did not reach a room. Which leaves the question of what a child in this city did that was not work. And there is an answer, and it cost a penny. A penny gaff was a shop with the fittings taken out. A stage at one end, a piano if there was one, benches or nothing at all to sit on, and a room filled to the walls. Several performances a night, one after another, the audience turned out and a fresh one let in. The material was highwaymen, robbers, murderers, songs, and dancing, played fast and loud. You cannot go and stand in one. Not a single one survives as what it was, and what we have instead is a description written by a man who paid his penny, went in, and looked at the room rather than the stage. The audience was costermonger boys and girls from 8 or 9 years old up to about 14, and errand children out of the workshops. And there was no half price for children. Halving the price for children would have halved the take, because there was nobody else in the room. That is worth sitting with because it cuts against the picture in a useful direction. A very large number of children in this city had a penny of their own, earned by themselves to spend exactly as they chose. And there was somewhere to spend it, and they went in enormous numbers several nights a week. The gaffs were condemned continuously and loudly as corrupting, for the crime in the plots, and for the crowding and for the hours. Some of that was fair. They were packed and hot, and there was no getting out of most of them quickly. But a good deal of the condemnation came from people who had never previously given a moment's thought to where a working child was supposed to go in the evening, and who did not propose anything whatever to put in its place. So the shape of a childhood here was 6 days of earning or minding or running or sitting in a corner of a room where somebody else was working. And then a penny put by, if the week allowed it, and an hour in a hot room watching a man in a paper hat play a murderer. And then Sunday came. Sunday was the one day the whole city stopped, and what a child did with it depended entirely on who had claimed them. A Sunday school, a chapel, a street, or nobody at all. It was raining in Whitechapel on the evening of the 5th of November, 1855, and 2 men who had wandered further east than they intended found themselves outside the workhouse at 8 o'clock. Against the wall of the building on the wet pavement stones were 5 bundles of rags. That is the phrase in the account, and the account is worth taking at its own pace, because the man writing it took some trouble not to improve on what he had seen. He went to the bundle nearest the workhouse door, touched it, and shook it gently. The rags moved, and a head came out of them. A young woman of 23 or 24, gaunt with want, filthy and, as he noted, not naturally ugly. They went and knocked at the gate and asked whoever came why 5 women were sitting outside a building whose entire purpose was to take people in. They were told there was no room. They pressed him and got nothing further. So they left, and on the way out they gave each of the 5 women a shilling, which was all that either of them could do. The piece ran as the lead article in Household Words on the 26th of January, 1856. The building those women could not get into was, by this decade, holding a population almost entirely unlike the one it had been designed for. The system had been built on a theory about the able-bodied idle, that relief must be made less appealing than the worst available work, or people would prefer relief. That is a coherent principle provided the people applying are capable of working and choosing not to. By the 1850s, most of those inside were the old, the infirm, the orphaned, the sick, and unmarried women with children. They were not choosing the workhouse over employment. There was no employment on the other side of the choice because they were 70, or blind, or 4 years old. The system went on operating exactly as though there were. What that looked like from inside was a classification. Inmates were sorted at admission into categories: able-bodied men of 16 and over, able-bodied women of 16 and over, infirm men, infirm women, boys between 7 and 15, girls between 7 and 15. And the categories were held apart, with no contact permitted between them at any time. Which means a family arriving at the gate together was divided at the door. A husband and wife of 40 years went to separate wards and did not see each other again for as long as they were inside. A mother went one way, and her 9-year-old son went another. The labour was oakum for the men, which meant picking old tarred rope apart into its fibres by hand until the fingers gave out, or breaking stone. For the women, it was laundry and cleaning. Attached to most workhouses was a casual ward, giving a night or two to anybody passing through in exchange for a task the following morning. The thing to hold on to is that there was no villain anywhere in it. Nobody was being beaten. What was happening was that a rule designed for one population was being applied correctly, without malice and to the letter, to an entirely different one. There is nothing Gothic in the horror of the Victorian workhouse. It is administrative, and it is considerably harder to look at for that reason. Which brings the day off. Sunday was the only unbroken stretch of hours most Londoners had, and a day off with no money in it does not work the way a day off is supposed to work. What it consists of is a search for somewhere to be. Somewhere warm, indoors, that does not require a purchase in order to stay, and that will not ask you to move along. Days like that run a great deal longer than they sound, and finding somewhere to sit is the whole of them. There was one institution in every parish in London that answered that description exactly. It was open, it was free, and it had seats in it. On the 30th of March, 1851, the same Sunday as the population census, the government set out to discover how many people were using them. The exercise was designed by a 28-year-old barrister named Horace Mann, and he made a decision at the outset that shaped everything after it. He would not ask individuals what they believed. He considered the question inquisitorial, and he expected the answers to be vague professions rather than facts. So in place of belief, he counted buildings, seats, and attendances on a single day. The results were published in 1854, and for London they were bleak. Measured as attendances against population, the city came out at about 33 per 100. And once that was corrected for people who had gone more than once in the day, the figure fell to about 27. It varied enormously by district. Shoreditch came out around 15. The City of London came out at 83, which is a number to be explained rather than admired, since the city had more church seating per resident than anywhere in England, the churches being medieval, and the residents having almost all moved out. Mann also calculated how much additional accommodation would be needed for even 58% of the population to be able to attend at all. London, he found, would require 94% more seating than it possessed, very nearly double. His phrase for the result was spiritual destitution. The churches read that as a shortage of provision, which was convenient because a shortage of provision can be answered by building. It may have been that, it may equally have been that a very large number of people who had worked 6 days declined to spend the 7th sitting still being addressed. And there is a third thing the census could not see, which is what happened when a poor family did turn up. In a great many churches, the good pews were rented by the year, and the free seats were placed where free seats got placed, and marked. A person arriving without money walked to a designated part of the building in front of everybody, every week. That is not the only reason attendance was lowest in the poorest districts, but it is a substantial one, and it was being pointed out at the time by people inside the church as well as outside it. And then there was the other thing every parish did, which was bury people. London had been running out of ground for at least a generation. The churchyards had been in use for centuries and were full in a literal, physical sense. And what happened when a full churchyard went on, accepting bodies had been set out in detail as early as 1839 by a surgeon called George Walker in a book titled Gatherings from Graveyards. The case that made his name was a chapel in Clement's Lane, off the Strand. Enon Chapel had a vault beneath its floor, and into that vault, across about 20 years, had gone bodies in the thousands, while the congregation held its services in the room directly above them. The reason was a price. A burial at the parish church of St. Clement Danes cost £1, 17 shillings and twopence. At Inon Chapel it cost 15 shillings. That gap is the whole explanation, and the whole of the sadness in it. Nobody chose a vault under a chapel floor. They chose the only funeral they were able to pay for. Parliament closed the inner London grounds by an Act of 1852, and the burying moved outward to the great new cemeteries at the edge of the city, and then past the edge entirely. From the 13th of November, 1854, there was a railway for it, a private terminus beside Waterloo, and a train running down into Surrey to a cemetery at Brookwood, carrying coffins and mourners on the same service. And it was sorted. The waiting rooms at the London end were partitioned by class and by religion. So were the carriages, for the living, and separately for the dead. At the Surrey end there were 2 stations inside the cemetery grounds, one for Anglicans and one for everybody else, with refreshment rooms to match. A funeral could be bought first class, second or third, and the coffin travelled in the compartment that went with the ticket. A pauper's coffin did not share a compartment with a wealthier corpse. The arrangement that had governed a person's entire life went on governing for the length of one more journey, out of a city that had no room left for them, which is why the funeral mattered so much, and why households with no capacity to put anything aside at all put something aside against this. What made a pauper burial frightening had nothing to do with what happened to the body. It was public, and it was permanent, and it could not be explained away afterwards. Everybody on the street knew what a parish funeral looked like. It was a statement about a family, made at the worst possible moment in front of every person they knew, and there was no taking it back. So the money went by, week after week, out of a budget with no room in it, against a day that could not be predicted and could not be put off. It is one of the very few expenses in this whole city that arrived without warning and could not be argued down. The old churchyards were closed and, for the most part, planted. A good many of them are small public gardens now, with the stones moved to the walls and benches where the paths ran. You have probably sat in one. The dead went out of London, south and west, past the last houses, onto ground that had been fields the year before, a direction the city had been using for a long time, and for more than one purpose, and mostly without ever looking at what was out there. At 3 a.m, the city is not asleep. It is being restocked. The sound is wheels, iron tires on stone a long way off, and then closer, coming in from the west and the south along roads that are empty of everything else. Nobody is out to hear them except the people whose work this is. It is a sound most of us have half woken to at some point and slept through again, the ordinary business of the world going on without an audience, so that the world will be ready when the audience wakes up. The carts are coming from the market gardens, within a few miles of the built edge of London, on ground at Battersea and Chelsea and Fulham and Isleworth, and out east at Hackney and Bow, there was some of the most intensively worked agricultural land in England, not farms in the ordinary sense. Gardens, cropped hard several times a year, growing vegetables for a market that was 2 hours away by horse, and that would take everything they could produce. What made that ground yield the way it did was manure, and the manure came from the city. Horse dung swept off the streets, night soil carried out of the cesspits by the men who were only permitted to work in the dark, which means the carts ran both ways. A cart that took waste out of London in the small hours came back the following night, loaded with cabbages and turnips and salad for Covent Garden. The city's excrement went out on the same axles that brought the city's dinner in, and the whole arrangement turned over about once a day, indefinitely, and had done so for centuries. It was ending as the decade closed, and the thing that ended it was the improvement. Once the waste went into Bazalgette's pipes and out to the estuary, the gardens lost the manure that had made them worth working. The railways brought produce from further off and cheaper. Within a generation, most of that ground was under houses, and it is under houses still. The milk came from even closer in. There were cows kept inside London, in sheds behind shops, in yards, in cellars, among the streets and squares, in the middle of the built city. And the men who kept them supplied most of what Londoners drank. The milk went from the animal into a can, and from the can into a jug at a door, sometimes within the hour, still warm. It was a trade that ran on proximity, and it ended when the cattle plague came through in 1865 and went through those cramped sheds faster than anybody could stop it. By 4 or 5 in the morning, the markets are working. Covent Garden has been going for an hour or two. Billingsgate opens for the fish. The coffee stalls are lit, and the men who have been driving since midnight stand at them with a cup and a baked potato and their hands round both. And they are not the only people awake. The bakers have been working through the night because bread has to be ready in the morning, and there is no other hour to make it in. The nightmen are finishing because the law gives them no other hour either. A constable is somewhere on his route, arriving at a corner at the time he is expected to arrive at it. Somewhere a woman who has been sewing since the light went is still sewing, and in the doorways and against the walls there are people who did not get in anywhere, and who are waiting for it to be light enough to move. We know a great deal about all of these people. We know what they earned and what they paid for bread, what they wore and what they owed and what they died of, because those things generated paper. Registers, returns, ledgers, inquiries, court records, a journalist's notebook. What we know almost nothing about is how any of them slept. There is one thing that can be said, and it comes out of the arithmetic rather than out of anybody's testimony. Almost nobody in this city slept alone. A room held a household. A bed held whoever was small enough to share it. A lodging house held strangers at a few pence a head. Solitary sleep, a room of one's own, a door that shut, silence, was among the most expensive things London had to offer, and the overwhelming majority of the people in it went their entire lives without a single night of it. Then the light goes. The lamplighter's work their way along the main streets. Fires are banked in the grates that have them, and on certain nights in November and December, in the right conditions, the smoke does not go anywhere at all. Cold air settles into the river basin. Warmer air lies over the top of it like a lid, and everything coming out of every chimney in the city is held down at street level and kept there. It turns yellow. It comes into rooms through shut windows and lies along the floor. Traffic stops. There are accidents on the bridges, and people are paid to walk ahead of carriages carrying a light. It is the same material that was in the air on the first morning of all this. It has simply had nowhere to go. Almost none of that world is left, and the pieces that are left are not the ones anybody would have predicted. The building of glass came down out of Hyde Park and went up again at Sydenham, and stood there for 80 years, and burned in 1936. The model cottage that the commissioners would not have on the ground is still in Kennington Park, doing nothing, free to look at. The sewers are still carrying. The site of the pump in Soho is marked, and people walk past the marker all day without reading it. The closed churchyards became gardens. The rookery at St Giles is under offices. Church Lane is not on the map. The market gardens are streets, and the cowsheds are flats, and there is no penny gaff anywhere in England. What survived best was paper. 17 notebooks in a woman's own handwriting at Trinity College. 4 volumes of interviews taken in the street, still in print. Still the best account anybody has of how that city actually worked. A physician's map of Soho. A curate's report to a vestry. A summary of the laws concerning women written in plain language so that women could read what was true about them. Parish registers with the signatures and the crosses. A tax threshold. A census. The buildings went. The documents are what came through. And what we hold, having spent this long inside them, is not the hardness. The hardness is real, and it is on every page of the record, and none of it should be softened. But it is not the part that reaches across. What reaches across is that all of it was got through. The water was carried up the stairs. The step was scrubbed. The shirt was finished, and the thread was paid for out of the penny. The clothes went to the pawnbroker on Monday and came back on Saturday and were worn to church on Sunday. Somebody put money aside every week against a funeral that had not happened yet. None of those people thought they were enduring anything remarkable. They were getting through a Tuesday in the way that people get through a Tuesday, and that is the one part of their lives we recognize completely. There is one more person in this, and she is the one most likely to still be there in the morning. She was 8 years old and she sold watercress, bought before dawn and tied into bunches and worth nothing by noon. She wore a thin dress and a shawl that had come apart and carpet slippers, in weather that was not weather for any of it. And when a man with a notebook asked her about toys and games, she looked at him in a way that ended the question and told him that caring about sugar sticks was a thing for children, and that she had a living to earn. Nobody wrote down her name. He wrote down everything else: the price of the cress, the size of the bunches, the hours, the exact words she used. He did not take her name, or he took it and did not keep it. And so the most quoted child in the whole of Victorian London has gone about unnamed for 175 years. That is not an oversight to be indignant about. It is the ordinary condition of almost every person in this city, and she is visible at all only because one man stopped in the street and asked her something. Behind her stand 2 1/3 million people who were never asked anything. We have spent this evening with a handful of them. All of them are long gone now. The rooms went, the fires went out. The city they woke up into was pulled down and built over and pulled down again. You are warm. It is now. It has been now the whole time. And out on the roads tonight, in the dark, at the hour when almost nobody is awake to notice, somebody is bringing the morning in on a cart, so that a sleeping city will find its breakfast where it expects to find it. That has not stopped once since. Good night.